Oh, okay. We will get started now. Thank you very much and welcome to our second session on the workshop on good regulatory practices and its implementation in the medical device sector. We're going to go through some housekeeping messages. If I can get the next one, please. So again, this session is being recorded to be uploaded along with the presentations at the MDRC website. Simultaneous interpretation to both French and Portuguese are available. You just have to click at the globe icon at the bottom of your screen at the Zoom platform. We do keep microphones of all the participants closed in order to prevent background noise and make it possible to have a clear conversation and, of course, a clear recording. And to make it this an interactive session, we would appreciate if you can post your questions using preferably the Q&A feature of the Zoom platform. And we prefer to do that because in that way we can also document and keep a record on all the questions that have been asked. Whereas if we have them in the chat box, we lose them at the end of the event. And again, the questions that you would be posting are going to be voiced by the responsible to moderate each of the sessions. And for the speakers, again, we kindly propose if you can have your cameras on while your presentation. That always helps the interpretation team for a more accurate job. Next slide, please. So for today, we have a really very, I would say, robust agenda. We have really great speakers joining us. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Pauline Wire-Mu, who is the chair of the Africa Medical Device Forum, who is going to be helping us to moderate our first session, where we will have Agnes Kidjo from the World Health Organization sharing on the basic reference that are critical to the work that we are doing in regards of good regulatory practices and good reliance practices. So Pauline, Agnes, welcome. Thank you very much. And Pauline, the floor is yours. We can see you, Pauline, but your microphone seems to be closed.
I hope you can hear me now.
We can see you and we can hear you now. Thank you very much, Pauline.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sandra. A very good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to everyone who has joined us this afternoon. My name is Pauline Warimo, as Sandra has introduced me. I am the chair of the Africa Medical Devices Forum, which is the technical committee under the African Union advising and looking at supporting African countries to accelerate medical device regulation. I work at the Pharmacy and Poisons Board, which is the national regulatory authority in Kenya. And I'm really pleased to be able to moderate this afternoon session that is going to be conducted by my good friend, my colleague, and also a really wonderful presenter, who is Agnes Kidjo. I know she has a really wonderful presentation on regulatory updates this afternoon, and I do not want to take too much of her time so that we can engage in the discussion and presentation, because I know it's one that is filled with a lot of exciting information and also stuff and information that is really relevant and updated. So just to prepare, she'll be discussing and going through the Global Model Regulatory Framework, Good Regulatory Practices, that is a WHO document that was released, and advising on updated regulatory practices. So without much ado, let me hand over to you, Agnes. There you are. You're most welcome.
Thank you very much, Sandra and Pauline. I would like to, first of all, take this opportunity to thank the organizers for providing this platform for WHO to present these important tools to some of our very important stakeholders that are attending this session from yesterday and today. So a brief introduction from my side, so you know exactly where I am within the WHO. So my name is Agnes Sitakijo. I'm a former regulator. I used to work at the Tanzania Food and Drugs Authority. I work for WHO as a technical officer in a team called Facilitated Product Introduction Team. So this is a team that assists or supports national regulatory authorities to introduce regulatory systems, but also to facilitate product introduction, including aspects on market authorization. And so I'm not so sure who is aware or how many of you are aware of the 3 important tools that I'm going to present briefly to you this afternoon or in other places morning. So you can feel free to indicate this on chat so I know exactly where to focus more my information, but I'm going to take you through the good regulatory practices document, good reliance practices document, and last but not the least, the WHO Global Model Regulatory Framework, which was recently revised by the WHO. So to begin my presentation, I'll start with a slide that just to provide a bit of context. We all understand that access to medical products has been and continues to be a global challenge with major consequences on healthcare systems. There are many factors and reasons that contribute to inadequate access of these important products. But I think one of them, which relates to the topic we are discussing today, is the inadequacy in regulatory capacity and lack of collaboration and work sharing in regulation of medical product between national regulatory authorities. So the tools that have been developed and which I'm going to provide an overview today in my presentation are geared towards regulatory systems strengthening. And this came about in the context of the World Health Assembly Resolution 67.20 of 2014 to advance or to provide for WHO to provide further support to national regulatory authorities, especially on regulation of medical products, including medical devices. So WHO is implementing this important resolution through a document which we call WHO Regulatory Action Plan. It's a 5 years, 5 years document from 2019 to 2023. And so all the strategies, including development of these tools, is related to the action plans in this important WHO document. The WHO system strengthening aspect comprises of 2 important groups, and sorry I didn't include this in this particular slide, but I can always update. So 2 important aspects in WHO systems regulatory strengthening. One is capacity building. So we do capacity building by providing training, but also specialized technical assistance to national regulatory authorities upon a request or during or after assessment using the global benchmarking tool. But we do also have another important element, which is to promote smart regulation. And so this is where these tools that I'm presenting today actually fall into this category of product. So how do we promote smart regulation? Is by coming up with different guidelines and regulatory tools, but also promoting collaboration, harmonization, and reliance practices between the national regulatory authorities, but also to speak to or promoting the element of regulatory agilities or flexibility, which was very, very crucial in the midst of COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip this slide because it really speaks about the other factors that contributes to inadequacy in access or lack of access of medical products. Next slide, please. this is a very important slide because it talks about the benefits of regulatory harmonization, which is a major component in the one of the important documents that I'm going to present next, the Good Regulatory Practices Guidance document. So it speaks about the importance of regulatory harmonization for all stakeholders, but I think most important, the patients. So in terms of the patients, the benefit that they would realize if regulatory or regulators or regulatory requirements are harmonized include also quicker access to more affordable medical products of assured quality, but also improved assurance that available medical products are safe. Because even myself, when I'm taking a test or when I'm taking a medicine, I would like to be confident that what I'm taking is actually safe for myself and for my family. So there are many benefits that you can read afterwards in this slide that can be an outcome of regulatory harmonization. Next slide, please. So the first tool that I'm going to speak about is the Good Regulatory Practices guidance document. So this document, next slide, please. It speaks about or presents very high-level principles which are applicable to all national regulatory authorities responsible for regulation of medical products, including, of course, medical devices, irrespective of their maturity or resources, so that regulators can establish regulatory systems which are, or a regulatory system which is sound, science-based, affordable and responsive. So the other reason for coming up with these principles is to also provide NRA with a benchmark. So they serve as a benchmark and thereby assisting NRAs in the application of good practices, which would create a good foundation for introducing reliance and recognition concepts, which I'm also going to speak in my next slides. And so if authorities decide to work, for example, towards the same standards or in a similar way, using the same or similar requirements, then trust can be built within the NRAs and engage more on collaborative work, such as work sharing and joint activities. So these are some of the reasons why we came up with this important document that emphasizing the concept of collaboration through very well-established principles. Next slide, please. And it all, of course, originates from the World Health Resolution 67.2. In this slide, I'm just going to be very brief because it speaks about the objective, and I've touched a little bit on the objectives, but one is to ensure that there is sound and effective regulation of medical products, higher quality regulation, better regulatory decision-making and compliance, as I will explain also in my next slides, but more efficient regulatory systems and better public health outcomes. So when you have efficient regulatory systems, definitely public health outcomes are better. And in this case, safe, quality assured medical products, up-to-date regulatory systems because of the harmonization elements of the requirements. And so countries will be able to come together and speak together and update the requirements for regulating these products, but also promoting trust. I've mentioned also in my previous slide that very important that when regulators come together, it promotes a lot of trust among each other to enhance reliance in collaboration work, and of course, improve international cooperation, which we also witnessed heavily during the COVID-19 pandemic. So the good regulatory practices is supported by other WHO documents, which we can discuss some other time, but we have other documents that speaks to good governance practices, good reliance practices, which I'm going to speak next, good review practices, and quality management system for regulatory authorities. So all these are complementary documents to the good regulatory practices. Next slide, please. So this is like the heart of the good regulatory practices, because it summarizes the key messages within the good regulatory practices guidance document. The concept and principles of the good regulatory practices include 9 important principles. You have legality, you have consistency, impartiality, proportionality, flexibility, clarity, efficiency, and transparency. So the whole idea and the whole concepts and the proposals that are within the good regulatory practices speak or touches to these 9 important principles. But very important that the principles are applied to the overall regulatory system. So not just in one aspect of the regulatory systems. And I think this was also mentioned by a speaker yesterday, the first speaker yesterday, that it really has to cut across the overall regulatory system. So not only the National Regulatory Authority, but associated institutions, the regulatory framework, and also the regulatory work, and of course, resources allocated to cater for these regulatory activities. So all these principles need to be applied all across the regulatory system. For application and the implementation of good reliance practices to be effective, there's a need to have what we call GRP enablers. So these are good regulatory practices enablers that need to be in place. There are foundational elements that need to be introduced in order to achieve this desired regulatory outcome and impact. So when we speak, for example, about legality, it means that the regulatory systems and the decision should flow, that flow from them must have a sound legal basis. You cannot have a regulatory system that has no foundation in the legislation. So you need to have regulatory framework and regulatory system that have been very well defined in the legal system. And the regulatory framework should provide the necessary authority, scope, and flexibility to safeguard and promote health. So we expect that within the legal framework, there's a need to have very clear definition in terms of the scope, the mandate of the National Regulatory Authority, but also provide a bit of flexibility in case of public health emergencies, or when there is a need to approve or to introduce a product during special cases. And so the rest of the principles apply accordingly throughout the regulatory systems. So this is in a nutshell a summary of what is embedded or is promoted within the good regulatory practices. The principles themselves, 9 principles, the GRP enabler, but also the idea of both the principles and the enablers being incorporated throughout the regulatory systems. Next slide, please. So the next important tool developed by WHO is the good WHO good reliance practices. So what it means by or the meaning of or the big message in the WHO good reliance practices is that it does not imply dependency, because there has been misconception that when you're relying is as if you are depending on somebody else, or you are losing your independence to another national regulatory authority, but that's not the case. It is not an agency outsourcing its decision-making or responsibility to another national regulatory authority, but rather a smart way of facilitating or a smart way of improving effectiveness of regulatory outcomes. Instead of repeating the work that has been done by somebody else, Reliance really promotes a smart way of utilizing the outcome or leveraging on the outcome of the work that has been done by somebody else, and focus more on the activities that you cannot be able to rely on any other institution or any other external party. For example, there are some of the regulatory functions such as inspection activities. This needs to be done by the National Regulatory Authority itself. Inspection of especially of the facilities within the countries. But activities such as assessment of a technical file. These are some of the activities that you can outsource the final result of a report that has been done by somebody else to facilitate quick decision-making and improve regulatory decision and of course, impacting the access of products. So in applying Reliance in NRA's daily practices, the NRA will still maintain its independence, but also accountability in regulatory decision-making, because at the end of the day, the decision is made by the local national regulatory authority. Although some of the information has been borrowed or is leveraged from an external source or trusted institutions, but the final decision is made by the National Regulatory Authority. So this is a smart way in which a National Regulatory Authority can use its resources, of course, considering inadequacy of resources in most of the national regulatory authorities or countries. The next slide, please. Sorry, so I was speaking to this particular slide. For some reason, I didn't notice that the slide didn't move, but my message was to speak to this particular slide, that Reliance doesn't mean dependency, but just a smart way to improve effectiveness of regulatory functions. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So the good Reliance practices has principles and concepts. I didn't include the slide for principles, but I'll be happy also to update this presentation to include also the principles. So good regulatory practices, as the same as good regulatory practices, is guided by 6 important principles. So one of them is universality. So it applies to National Regulatory Authority, regardless of the maturity or regardless of the resources. So this is one of the principles that Reliance is advocating. And for example, some of the IMDRF member states, the International Medical Devices Forum members are conducting what we call MDSAP. I'll speak a little bit about it in my next slides. So through the MDSAP project, regulators are able to share reports which have been done by a specific nominated or recognized conformity assessment body, and the report is shared in a database that can be assessed or accessed by IMDRF members for them to ease the inspection element. Instead of each of the members to go out and conduct inspection, they are able to access the information in one common database based on an inspection or audit that was done by selected conformity assessment body in one of the countries of the IMDRF. So this is one of the excellent examples to demonstrate that IMDRF countries are high-income countries, but they've realized a need to effectively utilize their resources. Instead of all of them going to the same manufacturer, they have allocated or selected a specific body that can conduct inspection on their behalf, and then they would only access the outcome of the inspection. So it speaks about universality. So it doesn't matter whether you are a high-income country or a low-income country or middle, the good Reliance practices can benefit all levels of national regulatory authorities, but also sovereignty on decision making. I think I've also touched this a little bit. that the NRA will still maintain its independency on the final decision. So as much as you have relied, but you can still either approve or reject the product, regardless of the recommendation of the NRA where you have relied this information from. The issue of transparency, transparency is also very key. It's a very key enabler to adapting new requirements. So requirements needs to be very transparent. There is also an issue of consistency. So when you're applying reliance, you need to establish requirements which are very specific and very well defined for categories of products and of course for the processes. It has to be very consistent, so that you have to have in place well-defined processes, but also scope of product is also very important, but also the issue of competency. I will add this slide to this presentation so that you can also familiarize yourself with these important principles. But what I wanted to speak about in this slide, which is very, very important, is the key concept that governs implementation of the good reliance practices. So one of the key concepts that is promoted in this important document is use of what we call recognition, but also reliance. So these are two different terms that are promoted, or mechanisms that are promoted within the good reliance practices. When you speak about recognition, this is when a national regulatory authority has decided to consider the final decision by another national regulatory authority without carrying out any sort of assessment. And I've seen this also very useful during the COVID-19 pandemic, where regulators would just access information on the final decision made either by the US FDA or made by WHO through the EUL to make a decision on whether to import or to register COVID-19 therapeutics and diagnostics. But reliance is when you rely on the outcome, on a report or on an assessment outcome conducted by another national regulatory authority. So these two important elements are highly promoted in the good reliance practices. With recognition, it can be either unilateral or it can be mutual. So one could be maybe one direction, but mutual could be based on a specific signing of memorandum of understanding, but also a harmonization of requirements is very important. If you have similar requirements, it's very easy to apply these strategies or these mechanisms. But when you have different requirements, it can be a bit difficult for one to use recognition, for example, if they do not have enough information about the regulatory requirements, or if they do not trust what the other national regulatory authority is doing. And this is why harmonization, convergence, work sharing and cooperation is highly advocated within the good regulatory practices, such that trust is built within the national regulatory authorities. And then there is also a life cycle approach. So pre and post approval activities, including also post approval changes, and in this case for market authorization, is very, very key. So you don't just end to one phase of the product life cycle. You just don't end on the pre-approval phase, but we advocate that reliance is extended also for post-approval activities. But another very important aspect is on a risk-based approach. We are also advocating within the good reliance practices that your approach or national regulatory authority approach when you are applying reliance should be risk-based. So a strategy needs to be very well defined, including describing the type and source of products that you will be relying, or the type of products that you'll be evaluating, For medical devices, for example, there are 4 different classes of medical devices. So regulators will need to assess and decide whether they're going to rely also on class A, which are low risk products, or are they going to rely, for example, on only class D assessment outcomes from another national regulatory authority. So all these things needs to be very well defined within the national regulatory authority, but we are really advocating and promoting that it should be risk-based approach. Otherwise, if it is not risk-based approach, it means NRIs would end up doing all the activities themselves, while we are advocating for reliance and recognition concepts. But also regional reliance mechanism is also advocated. When you're talking about regional reliance mechanism, this is where NRIs are advised to look for opportunities for reliance. For example, if your country is in Central Africa, or is in East Africa, or is in South Africa, there is a SADC. Look for opportunities to rely, to work, to collaborate with the national regulatory authorities within your region to facilitate access to products or effectiveness of regulatory decision, and conduct what we call smart regulation, and focus only on activities that can't be done externally. So these are some of the key concepts that are promoted through the Good Reliance Practices Guidance document. Next slide, please. I'm going to just speak briefly on these examples. I've spoken a little bit on the MDSAP system in the MDRF, which I think is very popular for many of the regulators. But there is also what we call collaborative registration procedure within the World Health Organization. So this is a procedure where WHO shares the assessment outcome with interested countries based on voluntary agreement after confirmation of the signing of the agreement to join, but also confirmation of the sameness of the product and concept by the manufacturer, who is the WHO pre-qualification holder of the product. So this is a very effective reliance mechanism, and it has been very, very helpful in many of the national regulatory authority to facilitate also product introduction. There are also other examples on reliance. So one of them is the Thai-Singapore regulatory reliance, which was done as a pilot and was also very successful. There was another one also during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's still ongoing on SARS-CoV-2 assays. So WHO is also sharing assessment outcomes of the reports for COVID-19 assays. So please feel free to reach out to us so we can explain to you how to join this procedure. I don't know how I'm doing in terms of time, Chair, but I'll try to move a little bit quickly so we can allow time for discussion.
You have some more time. You have some time. Keep going.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So next slide, please. This beautiful and colorful slide demonstrates or speak to the implementation. So you have heard about the concepts, you have heard about the principles of both good reliance regulatory practices and good reliance practices, but I really wanted to also demonstrate the implementation. So what have we done so far in terms of implementation of these important documents? So one of the things that we have done from the WHO side is dissemination and translation. I've included a link where you can be able to access these important documents, but also there is an ongoing translation of these important documents into all the 6 UN languages. So once the translation is completed, we will be happy to share with you these important versions that have been translated in the all UN languages. So dissemination and translation to us is very, very important, so that it reaches a wider audience and it reaches as many regulators, if not all of them, to be able to utilize the good recommendations that are promoted in these important documents. And then the second is the integration with the regulatory systems, strengthening in other WHO activities. So the elements of the good reliance practices and good regulatory practices are embedded within the global benchmarking tool. So there is a global benchmarking tool to assess regulatory effectiveness or stability of the regulatory systems. So all these principles that I've mentioned previously for the good regulatory practices and good reliance practices have also been embedded within the global benchmarking tool, not only for medicine, but also the recently published global benchmarking tool plus medical devices has also incorporated those elements. Remember, I mentioned in my earlier slides that we are looking for consistency in terms of how the national regulatory systems are developed or are formed, and to be able to have consistency on how regulators conduct their business, but also to build trust among the national regulatory authorities. And that's why I mentioned in my early slides that the principles of GRP are used as a benchmark. So we expect that all the national regulatory authority would adopt and implement those elements within their national regulatory systems. But also, of course, when you're doing assessment through using the global benchmarking tool, there is something called institutional development plan. So the institutional development plan is the outcome of the global benchmarking assessment, or the assessment done by using the global benchmarking tool. So during implementation of the institutional development plan, we make sure that whatever suggestion that we are providing to the regulators is aligned also within the principles of the good regulatory practices and good reliance practices to improve effectiveness of the national regulatory authority. But also in the WHO listed authorities, I don't know whether you are aware, or most of you are aware, that we are moving from a term stringent regulatory authority to what is going to be known as WLAs, or WHO listed authorities. So we are also we have embedded also these elements in the tool that is used to assess national regulatory authorities who wish to become WHO listed authorities. But once we have the list of WHO listed authorities, so these are going to be reference point for other national regulatory authority to engage with. So, for example, if one wants to engage in recognition element, or they want to go into or follow reliance practices, at least you will have a place where you can see a list of mature national regulatory authorities in which you may pick one or two to support you in your national regulatory work, be it market authorization or any other regulatory function as such. But also there is a document called Global Competence Framework. So this is a document which is still under development, but it should be finalized very, very soon. It speaks about or provides a framework in which the National Regulatory Authority will identify the competence within the National Regulatory Authority, but also have a very clear plan on how to improve a competency of the staff within the National Regulatory Authority. So all these elements within the GRP and GREL have been introduced in these important documents that I'm showing. Next slide, please. Another
Agnes, you have a few, about 5 more minutes.
Sure. So another area or on the implementation plan is communication, collaboration, and support to multi-stakeholder initiatives. So we are presenting, and this is why I'm also presenting in this forum to communicate to you what's in this document. But also we are planning to develop a curriculum and detailed training materials so that regulators are able to undergo training to understand more on these concepts. But at the moment, I've put a link where you can take an introductory online training on good regulatory practices. So please feel free to join and train yourself on these concepts. But also we expect to develop additional guidance and also recommendation in terms of the next steps. So one last important document that I wanted to speak about, if you can go to the next and the next slide. Yes, so I want to speak briefly on this Global Model Regulatory Framework. So the Global Model Regulatory Framework is a guidance document that was developed in 2017. And it has been in existence for almost 6-7 years. Recently, we conducted a review of this important document to introduce some of the recent developments with regards to regulation of medical devices, but also including recommendation to regulatory authorities on issues such as artificial intelligence, softwares, medical devices, but also making sure that the elements that have been introduced in the good regulatory practices and good reliance practices are also updated in this important document, but also experiences by the regulators when utilizing the Global Model Regulatory Framework also triggered WHO to update this important document that guides regulators on how to introduce regulatory systems for medical devices. I'm not going to speak about the rest of the remaining slides, but just one last slide before I close. Next slide, please. So this is the outlook of the outline of the revised Global Model Regulatory Framework. It was extensively and thoroughly discussed by the national regulatory authorities and other related stakeholders. The previous version had 5 chapters, but this, the revised version, which has recently been endorsed by the expert committee within the World Health Organization, and it is to be published during the World Health Assembly in May this year, has 7 chapters. So we have included 2 new chapters, which speaks to regulatory pathways, but also element on implementation. So why element on implementation? Because most times we've been asked by regulators that as much as we are providing very nice recommendations in these nicely developed documents, but we usually miss an implementation part. So when a regulator reaches a point to implement specific aspects of the recommendations, it can be a little bit difficult. So on the implementation, we have included a roadmap on how to implement, emphasizing on the issue of capacity development to NRIA staff, consultation, stakeholders consultation. So these are some of the elements that we have included, but also regulatory pathway to guide regulators on how to approach different processes that are normally challenging during the routine regulatory work. For example, a regulatory pathway on borderline products. We all know how complicated borderline products are. Issues around donation, for example. So there is very nice diagrams and flow charts that speaks to the different regulatory pathways that regulators can be able to adopt. In the next slides, I'm not going to present those, but you will have them for your own reference afterwards. I have clarified and outlined the specifics in each of the topics and which are the updates that have been made in each of the chapters of the revised Global Model Regulatory Framework. So you can just run through to the end, but I would like to thank you, Pauline, for the opportunity, and I would be happy to take up any question, and I hope I didn't rush, so I'll try next time to have very minimal number of slides so that I don't rush through, but otherwise I thank you and hand it over back to you.
Thank you, Agnes. Certainly the information on your presentation is well received, and I think and believe that we have learned a few things. specifically for me, I have really enjoyed relooking at reliance pathways, the need for flexibility by regulatory authorities, and also agility, which is the new term in ensuring that we can foster and support and facilitate accelerated products into our markets. I had requested and asked that colleagues can send questions in the chat box, and this would really help us to ensure that our Q&A session is as vibrant as possible. I seem not to have, unless Sandra, you can advise whether there are questions posted from outside the chat box, but from what I see, I do not have yet questions. If I'm allowed, I have two questions that perhaps just to keep the discussion on reliance going, but please also advise us, I know we have gone a little bit of our time, whether you will need for us to come back after the session. Sandra, could you please advise?
Yes, thank you, Pauline. No, we do not have any questions in the chat box either. So please go ahead with yours, and probably I'll have a comment after that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra. So Agnes and I wanted to just pick on the discussion, and it's really on the global model regulatory framework. This is a document that is very elaborate, very informative, and also well structured. The discussion perhaps today would be, how is the global model regulatory framework going to benefit countries that are in different levels of regulation? For example, in Africa or in Kenya or where I'm coming from, we have national regulatory authorities in different areas of regulatory framework. How is the global model regulatory framework going to help countries in whichever area or in whichever phase of regulation that is that they are in to achieve and to move ahead in accordance to what the model recommends? Over to you, Agnes. I think you're muted.
I was muted. So I thought I was taking both your questions and then I'll respond. So maybe if you can do the second one and then I will respond.
Excellent. And also, what are some of the lessons that we've learned from the pandemic on the use of reliance? Those are the two questions I wanted to have for you this afternoon.
So thank you very much, Pauline. And I'm very happy that you are one of the people that was heavily involved or participated, at least consistently, during the discussion of the global model regulatory framework. So I really wish to acknowledge your contribution to the drafting or revision of the global model regulatory framework. So I think one of the main benefits that I see for regulators is that the global model regulatory framework addresses all levels of national regulatory authorities. So it doesn't matter if it is a advanced regulatory authority or it is a less mature national regulatory authority, or if it's the regulatory authority that has nothing, it has just been established, but they don't know where to start. So the model provides recommendations to guide in terms of how do you then start to introduce the regulatory systems for medical devices. And if, for example, and this happens in, I think, in many of the national regulatory authorities who were previously regulators for pharmaceuticals, and all of a sudden they are given an extra responsibility to regulate medical devices. And so the question is, how do you then start? Because what we are discouraging is not to use the similar or the framework or the requirements that have been used for regulating pharmaceuticals and adopt these for medical devices. This is a big error that many regulators do. And so what we are suggesting is that even if you are a very experienced national regulatory authority for regulating medicines, you need to go back to the global model regulatory framework and familiarize yourself with the peculiarities on how you can begin to regulate medical devices. So two phases are advised in the global model regulatory framework. So basic level phase, but also advanced level phase. So for the basic level phase, it speaks to the minimum regulatory functions or elements that needs to be in place to allow effective regulation of these products. Remember, the objective or the public has some level of expectations to the National Regulatory Authority that the products that are in the market are safe. They don't care where you are, whether you are you're beginning to regulate, where you are in the middle of regulation, or you have advanced. So very, very important to make sure that the recommended regulatory functions at the basic level are in place. And once the resources are available, then you can advance swiftly towards the advanced regulatory activities that are also recommended in the global model regulatory framework. But it also speaks about some of the challenging products or some of the challenging regulatory areas. So it also provides a recommendation on how the National Regulatory Authority can navigate through some of these challenging regulatory functions, including lot-to-lot verification, testing, and many other challenges that regulators may face during implementation of the regulatory work. And on the second question, so I think I mentioned briefly on my presentation that one of the main lessons for me is that critical to engage in collaborative initiatives or collaboration initiatives, but also engage in introduce within your legal framework flexibility, agility, as you rightly mentioned, Pauline, because I think these were the key important elements that really facilitated decision-making by the National Regulatory Authority, really facilitated quick decision-making during the COVID-19 pandemic. So my call is to, and my request to regulators is that please make sure that these important elements, good reliance practices or reliance elements, flexibility, agility elements are part of your either administrative arrangement or part of your legal provision to allow flexibility in cases where a National Regulatory Authority is required to make a quick decision and to confirm safety and performance of these products. I hope I've answered your question, Pauline.
Indeed, you have, and I'm so grateful. And thank you so much, Agnes, for taking time and making the presentation and all the efforts. I can only summarize that it's important that we leverage on existing resources, that is human resource, technical know-how, information, in order for us to ensure that regulation and reliance really is speaking to those elements. There's a question from an anonymous attendee, and the question is, does the reliance model also guide the NRA that is requesting to do their own QMS audit of foreign manufacturing sites that already have certification to ISO 13485 and or MDSAP?
Okay, so very quickly, because I'm also being mindful of the time. So when you're engaging with in reliance mechanism, one of the area or item that we are discouraging is to repeat the work that has been done by somebody else. So when you are relying, the expectation is that you will only receive the report, and individually in your own office, you can do quick review of the report that has been shared by this institution, because principally the reason why you are relying is because there is a trust in what the other National Regulatory Authority would provide to you. And so ideally, we don't expect you to go back and conduct audits or go back and conduct performance evaluation for this product. But the expectation is that you would use the assessment outcome of the reports that have been shared by National Regulatory Authority that you're relying on, and do a quick review of the information. And in most cases, we recommend that maybe you look at the labeling information, because this will be different between the regions or between countries, or look at the, for example, issues around stability, just very few sections of the report that has been shared, and then make a regulatory decision. And this is the benefit for applying reliance mechanism. So we discourage repeating the work that has already been done by somebody else. If they have conducted audit based on ISO 13485 and you are satisfied based on the report that you have received that the inspection was conducted based on ISO 13485, then there is no need for repeating auditing this specific manufacturing site. Over.
Thank you, Agnes. Thank you very much for all the insight and all the information you've shared. I believe our session is over, and I'm excited to hand it over to you, Sandra. Thank you once again.
Pauline, thank you very much. Agnes, thank you very much. And just real quick, we have a request from Juan Alanis in the chat box. If you could share the link to the training on GRPs through the chat box, we would really appreciate that. Nevertheless, we're going to be sharing your whole presentation through the MDRC website. So yes, Agnes, please. You have your hand raised. Oh,
sorry,
your microphone.
Sorry, I didn't mean to raise my hand. I wanted to do a summed up. I'm going to send on chat. Thank you. Thank
you very much. Okay, so then it is my honor now to introduce to all of us Michelle Noonan. She's an international policy analyst with the Center for Device and Radiological Health at the US FDA. Michelle is going to share with us some of the most relevant information in regards of the international references that are produced by the IMDRF. Michelle, without further ado, thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Sandra. Hello, everyone. As Sandra said, I am an international policy analyst with the Food and Drug Administration in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. And I'm going to be spending the next few minutes talking about IMDRF, the membership process in that, and a little bit of background, and then going through all of the working groups that are currently open, and go over some of the documents that are being produced out of those working groups. Do we have the slides, or do I need to present those myself?
We will share that in a second, please. Thank you, Michelle.
Okay, thank you. Sure.
Sorry, Michelle, I'm having an issue. Just a minute, please.
That's okay. Thank you. Great. Okay. Okay, so thank you very much for sharing the slides. So just a brief overview of IMDRF, for the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. It was launched in February of 2012. It's the successor to the Global Harmonization Task Force, or GHTF. So in 2012, it became IMDRF. So the chair and secretariat rotate on an annual basis. You can see here on the screen the rotation that was started in 2012. Currently, the chair of IMDRF, chair and secretariat, is the EU. And the US is going to become the chair again next year in 2024. And I will say that even though 2023 just started, we are well into planning the activities that are going to be taking place here in the US. Next year, we will be hosting 2 in-person meetings. One will be on the East Coast of the US, most likely in Washington, DC. And we are looking at the West Coast of the US to host the second meeting that'll occur later on in 2024. So we are well into the planning process already for that. Decisions that come out of the IMDRF are made by consensus. It's not a voting type thing, it's by consensus. We do have 2 in-person meetings per year that normally occur in March and September. Of course, during COVID, you know, things had to change a bit. And so they did virtual and hybrid conferences. But the expectation is that, you know, now moving forward, that most of the meetings are in person. This just helps, as we all are aware of, it just helps facilitate better discussions, and it's just easier to get things done when we're in person. So we also do have 2 teleconferences that occur per year in January and July. Next slide. So this slide just shows the membership of IMDRF. There are several different types of membership that exist within IMDRF. So we have our official observers. So we have the WHO in Argentina. And official observers, they're not part of the management committee, but they consist of regulatory authorities and also WHO, as I stated previously. They do participate in the oversight of IMDRF activities, but they don't participate in the decision-making process. So they're at the table, at those meetings, involved in the discussion and everything, but they don't participate in that decision-making process. We also have our regional harmonization initiative. So this includes APEC, GHWP, and the Pan American Health Organization, or PAHO. So they also participate in meetings, all the closed door meetings as well. But they don't participate, again, same as official observers, they don't participate in that decision-making process. We also have our management committee members. You can see the various countries and also the EU as part of the management committee as well. We also have a fairly new membership category, I guess you could call it. It's the affiliate members. So these are affiliate members. The intent is that these are regulatory authorities who don't meet the criteria that's outlined in some of the official documents of IMDRF, of the official observer, but they still want to engage with IMDRF. The reason I'm talking about this is because I think, you know, this is a fairly new category of membership within IMDRF, and I encourage all of you who are on the line to go to the IMDRF website and take a look at the criteria that exists for affiliate members, and maybe if you meet that criteria, to consider putting in an application. You know, we want to encourage regulatory authorities around the world to join into IMDRF and be part of that process and come to the table. This really encourages harmonization throughout the world. Next slide, please. So the mission of IMDRF, again, is to strategically accelerate international medical device regulatory convergence. This promotes efficient and effective regulatory models for medical devices, and it, you know, while protecting and maximizing public health and safety. So the goals of IMDRF, again, we're all about harmonization. We're building on that work that was laid out, that laid the groundwork in the Global Harmonization Task Force. Also to address common public health regulatory challenges due to, you know, we're becoming more and more globalized. You know, we can't just think of our one country or our one region. It's a global world now, and medical device production happens all over the world. And there's also new technologies coming out every day, so wanting to address those. Also accelerating innovation by clear and practical regulatory expectations. I think we all can appreciate that, there's different requirements. Every country kind of has some sort of different requirements, but specific to their country or their region. But we want to try to make those as clear as possible. That just helps with innovation and bringing those products to market, and also focusing on pre-market and post-market requirements. Next slide. So these next couple of slides just talk briefly about the strategic plan for 2021 through 2025. So you can see here managing regulatory challenges for medical devices and innovative technologies by providing timely and appropriate guidance. We work a lot with standard setting bodies throughout the world to ensure that international standards are effective and meet the requirements for safety and performance standards for medical devices. Promoting further development of useful and relevant international standards for innovative technologies, and then also embarking on challenging journeys toward achieving single market review process for medical devices. Next slide. Also strengthening, sorry, can you go back one? There we go, thank you. So strengthening post-market surveillance for medical device and implementing regulatory lifecycle processes. So, information is constantly collected by regulators through the post-market surveillance activities that exist within, various countries. So, how is that information collected? How can it be standardized so that it's useful throughout the world? Also here, the UDI system, the unique device identifier system, trying to harmonize that as much as possible, which makes it easier to report safety issues or things like that that occur with medical devices. And then also seeking to assure an appropriate balance between pre-market and post-market requirements as part of the total product life cycle regulatory approach to medical devices. Next slide. So the priority areas, kind of touched on this a little bit, pre-market, developing risk-calibrated regulatory approaches for innovations, promoting harmonized pre-market review requirements for medical devices. The next priority area is post-market, so leveraging those monitoring and surveillance activities to ensure accessibility to safe and effective innovations for patients throughout the world. And then really our relationships with stakeholders. So promoting close communication about IMDRF activities and outputs with stakeholders. This includes the medical device industry, other regulators, international organizations, standards organizations, patient and professional associations as well, and then our regional harmonization initiatives. Next slide. So this just lists out the current open working groups that are currently open within IMDRF. We have 8 of those. I'll go through all of these in a little bit more depth in the subsequent slides, but you can also see here who chairs each of those working groups. Next slide. So there's also some closed working groups. These are working groups that achieved their goals and put out various documents talking about these topics, MDSAP, the UDI, unique device identification, patient registries, things like that. So these are closed working groups. They're no longer meeting, they're not active, but you can still access all of the documents that were put out by those working groups. Those are on the IMDRF website. Next slide. So now we'll walk through each of the open working groups and talk a little bit about what they're working on and the goals. So the first one is the Good Regulatory Review Practices Working Group. So the goal of this working group is to develop harmonized pre-market review requirements. You know, it lists out the benefits here. I think we can all agree that, you know, harmonized requirements definitely benefits the industry, benefit all regulatory authorities throughout the world. So, you know, as much as we can harmonize as possible, that's what this working group is aiming to provide some guidance on with that. So one of the current work items that this group is working on is developing pre-market reporting templates and instructions that guide those conformity assessment bodies in consistently evaluating marketing submissions and then documenting those certifications and recommendations in marketing review reports. So the working group is aiming to finalize this document by early next year. I should have updated this slide. These were initially put together last year, so it actually should occur early this year, hopefully, if everything goes according to plan. So be on the lookout for that document talking about those pre-market reporting templates and requirements. Hopefully that will come out soon. Next slide. So these are some of the final documents that have already been put out by this working group to address pre-market review processes. As you can see, one of the documents talks about competence training and conduct requirements for regulatory reviewers. We have a document out that talks about essential principles of safety and performance, and then another document also talking about principles of labeling. Next slide. And this slide lists out the various documents that have been put out about the recognition of conformity assessment bodies, or CABs. So you can see here the 4 documents that have been put out so far. It looks like they came out in like 2020 and 2021 as well. Next slide. So the next working group is the regulatory product system. The goal of this group is to develop a harmonized approach to regulatory submissions, benefits, allowing industry to file electronic applications with multiple regulatory authorities using the same method. So again, that harmonization of what's required by regulatory authorities is important for this. And then also, instead of using separate vocabularies, you know, one harmonized approach that reduces that regulatory burden while increasing predictability, transparency, and regulatory cooperation. So the current work item for this working group is the development of dynamic templates with specific electronic content for each regulatory authority as harmonized content for all regulatory authorities. So some of you may have heard of the eStar program, the eStar template that is something that's being piloted by FDA. So working on that, as well as the IMDRF table of contents. So when I first started in this position, I thought it was so interesting that so much time was being spent on a table of contents, right? it shouldn't be that complicated, but the table of contents that we're referring to here in IMDRF is much more detailed, and it lists out basically everything that IMDRF is working on and all of the documents that they're trying to put out. It's kind of a one place where it lists it all out. So it's a little bit more in depth than what we normally think of. So next slide. So this is, excuse me, this is a couple of the documents that have been put out by this working group. And you can see on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a template for the eStar. So this is the electronic submission and template resource. There's a couple of, there's some information there about the eStar and the that through how to submit. You can see at the bottom here, the application jurisdiction. Both FDA and Health Canada are listed here. So we've worked, FDA has worked closely with Health Canada on this eStar program. So, you know, the possibility of maybe expanding that at some point, or, but it's just basically a way for companies to submit an application that can go both to FDA and Health Canada at the same time for review. Next slide. So we also have our cybersecurity working group. The goal of this group is to provide fundamental concepts and considerations and general principles and best practices on medical device cybersecurity. Excuse me. So the current work items coming out of this group, they're in the process of developing 2 documents that talk about legacy medical devices and software bill of material concepts that are outlined in the document listed here. The working group is aiming to finalize both of these documents. It should say early this year, early 2023. Next slide. So this is one of the finalized documents. There's a principles and practices document for medical device cybersecurity that came out in 2020. The link is here on these slides, and you should have access to these slides through the MDRC website, I believe. So if not, we can work on getting you the slides if you need them. Next slide, please. We also have a personalized medical devices working group. The goal of this group is to develop a harmonized approach to defining medical devices that are manufactured for a particular individual. So this has become an emerging trend, you know, throughout the world, personalized treatments in the medical devices sector. So, you know, hoping to harmonize requirements for the safety, performance, and manufacturing of these products, and then providing a basis for consistent and transparent requirements across multiple jurisdictions. 2 of the, so the current work item in this one, they're building upon the 2 finalized IMDRF documents on the definitions and regulatory pathways for personalized devices. Next slide, please. So they have 2 finalized documents listed here, the definitions for personalized medical devices, regulatory pathways for those as well. Those are linked here on this slide. So you can take a look at them on the IMDRF website when you have a chance. Next slide, please. We also have our artificial intelligence working group. Again, harmonization is the theme here throughout all of these working groups. So achieving a harmonized approach to the management of AI medical devices. And the reason that this is so important is that our traditional regulatory approaches are, you know, they're not applicable to these, to artificial intelligence medical devices. They're inappropriate to efficiently manage machine learning enabled medical devices So many jurisdictions, in order to fill this gap, they've developed their own approaches to how they regulate machine learning enabled medical devices. So the goal of this group is to, take a look at all of those regulations that exist throughout the world in the various jurisdictions that have developed these, and working towards trying to harmonize those throughout the world. So the current work item, this working group published in May of 2022, the key terms and definitions document, and then they're also working on some new work item proposals as well. Next slide. So we also have our adverse event terminology working group. So the goal here is to develop harmonized technology to code information relating to adverse events that can occur with medical devices. So the benefits of this, again, improving efficiency of adverse event management with, working towards a single harmonized adverse event terminology and coding system so that multiple jurisdictions throughout the world can take a look at those events, and if it's harmonized information, then they can see how it's applicable to if they have those medical devices in their jurisdiction, and what happens, harmonizing that terminology, reducing ambiguity in those submissions, and improving the accuracy of capturing and reporting medical device related adverse events. So two of the current work items out of this group, they're working to develop common minimum data requirements for reporting, including defined data fields, data requirements, and data structure, and then also developing a common format for data exchange between jurisdictions as well. Next slide. So this slide just outlines kind of how this group is going about working on this, the harmonization of this adverse event terminology. There's a lot on this slide here, but basically the first phase is to define the sets of harmonized adverse event terms and codes throughout the world, throughout the jurisdictions. Throughout the world, and then phase two is developing common minimum data requirements for reporting that are standardized across jurisdictions. Next slide. So we also have our SAMD working group, or software as a medical device. So the goal of this group is to support innovation and timely access to safe and effective SAMD globally by identifying commonalities, establishing common vocabulary, and developing approaches for appropriate regulatory controls that promote regulatory convergence. So current work items out of this group, they're reviewing and updating existing SAMD IMDRF documents to reflect current principles and practices. So they're taking a look at the key definitions, document, risk framework, quality management systems, and clinical evaluation documents, and working on updating those. Next slide. So we also have our quality management systems working group. So this working group is also working on updating the existing documents that came out of the Global Harmonization Task Force. So, these are documents that came out before 2012. So they're, some of them are pretty out of date and don't align with current versions of standards, specifically 13485 and then 14971. So they're working on updating those documents so that they reflect current best practices. So these include the guidance on corrective and preventive action, or CAPA, guidance on the control of products and services obtained from suppliers, risk management principles, and then process validation guidance. Next slide. So that was a quick overview of IMDRF. So at this time, I don't know, where we are on time, but I'm happy to take any questions, or we can wait until the end of this forum, whatever works best for you. So Sandra and TC, I'll turn it back over to you.
Michelle, thank you very much. I think it was really a very informative session. I mean, having an overview on the hows to and the what is IMDRF doing towards advancing these much more coordinated efforts as to facilitate the work of the national regulatory authorities. I think it has been really very enlightful. I don't see any question in the Q&A. However, I probably ask, what is it that the US FDA has found as the reason to be a part of the IMDRF? Why do you think any regulator would benefit out of becoming an active participant to the IMDRF?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. I think, as far as FDA is concerned, we see the benefit of harmonization throughout the world. We are a large regulator. FDA regulates multiple products, not just medical devices. But our Center for Devices and Radiological Health, which handles all of the regulation of medical devices and radiological products, we have about 2,000 employees, I believe, total. So the FDA as a whole has thousands and thousands of employees. But so we are considered one of the larger regulators in the world. But even we have resource issues. So, and I can't imagine smaller regulators, that have just a handful of individuals working on medical devices. If we have resource issues, there's resource issues throughout the world. So we see the benefit of harmonization. We see the benefit of working with regulators throughout the world to streamline processes. The technologies that exist within the medical device industry are ever changing, and we have to be able to roll with that as well. And so I think, any regulator, small, large, medium-sized, can benefit from IMDRF membership and being involved with this organization. Different perspectives throughout the world from all different sized regulators and all different maturity levels is important. And if looking at that management committee or the membership slide that was in the beginning of the presentation, the management committee currently is made up of larger countries. So we are trying to respond to the fact that there are multiple different maturity levels throughout the world, and also multiple sizes of regulatory authorities. We want to be able to bring all of those to the table as much as possible, and try to harmonize and take into consideration the needs of regulators throughout the world. So I think that that's one of the big benefits of IMDRF membership, is just that harmonization and also regulatory reliance. Agnes talked about that in her previous presentation. So, regulatory reliance is also something that's really important and that IMDRF is working on as well.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I know we're running a little late, but I would not like to close before asking just another question. Probably, what would you recommend to, for the national regulatory authorities to begin to follow the work and the documents of the IMDRF? Becoming active members of the working groups, starting to implement the N47 essential principles, or a combination of many?
Yeah, there is a ton of good information on the IMDRF website. There you can access all of the documents that have been put out. It also has all of the documents that were put out by GHTF. I mean, they're older. They're still, some of them are still relevant. As I mentioned, we're still working to update those within some of the various working groups. But yeah, I would go to the website. I would take a look at. I can drop into the chat the document. It might be a little difficult to find on the website, but it lists out the various membership levels and the requirements. So I encourage everyone to, I can drop that link in the chat to that document, take a look at that and really consider where you are, if you meet the requirements, and if you do, to put in an application for one of those membership levels. And then also just monitoring that website and being aware of what's coming out and looking through the various documents that have already been published. There's a lot of good information there.
Oh, yes, it is. Michelle, we have a question at the Q&A. It is from Asma Atta. She says, thank you for the presentation, very informative. Can you please elaborate more about the affiliate membership and what are the criteria for the countries to be part of it?
Sure, yes. Let me just pull this over to, so affiliate members. So yeah, again, this is a fairly new membership level that was just recently created with an IMDRF. So affiliate members, that regulatory authority that becomes an affiliate member can participate in the IMDRF by attending open meetings, using IMDRF documents in part or in whole as a basis for their own regulatory framework. They can participate in working groups. They don't participate in the decision-making process of IMDRF, but they're they're there. They can participate in the various working groups and engage through that. There were criteria to become an affiliate member. You have to be a regulatory authority. You have to have a recognized commitment to the objectives of IMDRF, and you can demonstrate that commitment by implementing IMDRF documents or a detailed plan for implementation of those documents as part of your regulatory framework. And also commit to providing annual updates on the implementation of IMDRF documents at the management committee open meetings. Normally what happens is during these open meetings, the regulatory authority that's an affiliate member would give a presentation on kind of the activities that they've undertaken and how they're implementing these processes and procedures that are outlined throughout the IMDRF documents. So that I'll drop this link to this document into the chat, and that goes through the various membership categories and the criteria for each one. And then it also talks about how to apply for that as well.
Perfect. Well, I know we're really running a little late, but I have a couple of other questions. The first one is from an anonymous attendee. What is the difference between open and closed IMDRF meetings?
The open meetings, again, include these, the affiliate members. Also, we have another, hold on. Sorry, I have to look back at this document for a minute. There's also invited observers as well. So I was at the last in-person meeting that took place in 2022, which was in Sydney, Australia, because TGA was the chair of IMDRF last year. So during the open session, we had those affiliate members. We had countries that have expressed interest in IMDRF, who I think at that time we the affiliate membership might not have been official yet, but we had some countries that were working towards that. So they presented kind of what their regulatory authorities have been working on and how they're implementing IMDRF principles. We also had invited observers. So this included trade organizations. AVAMED was there. We had MITA there as well. So they were also talking about activities that they have been doing and working, how they're working with regulatory authorities throughout the world to work on IMDRF principles. The closed sessions, that's where we talk about all of the various activities that the working groups are undertaking. There's also discussions around what the working groups should be working on. Each working group has an opportunity to present what they have been working on. That's where proposals come in for new work items, things like that. So, so that's the difference between the open and the closed session. The closed session is like a business meeting where we talk about activities that are going to be worked on. So, yep.
Thank you, Michelle. I promise this is going to be the last one. We're going to be wrapping up, and my apologies to Marina. We'll have to have her cutting short. But we have this question from Mapaseka Gumbi from SABS, that is the South African Bureau of Standards. She says, from the regulator's point of view, which of the two documents would best support the good regulatory practices most? A quality management system standard like ISO 13485, or GMP for medical devices? This has been an ongoing conversation in the African region.
That's a good question. I don't know that I am able to answer it at this time. I would need to take a look a little bit more to just so I can make sure that I give an accurate answer. So if there's a way to maybe get me that question, and then I can work on responding. I just want to check a few things first before I give an answer.
Yeah, for sure, Michelle. We'll forward that to you. And
Okay.
of course, probably that is part of the topics that we might be discussing in the future capacity building activities that we are planning for Africa for the rest of the year. So, yeah. Michelle, really, thank you very much. Agnes has her hand raised. But anyways, Michelle, thank you very much, and look forward to continue with this session. Agnes, please.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sandra, and thank you, Michelle, for a very good presentation. It's very nice to see you again. I was just responding to this question on chat, so maybe I should just finish and press send, because I was in the middle of responding to Mapaseka on the same question. So just 2 minutes and you'll see my responses on chat. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So, Michelle, thank you very much. And then we are going to be then getting into the next topic in our session today, that is GRP checklist as a tool to ensure compliance. And for this, we have Marina Carvalho. She is the lead on good regulatory practices for the Medical Device Regulatory Convergence Project. Marina, so sorry that you are going to be having a little less time as planned, but look forward to listening to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. No problem at all. Good afternoon to everybody that is in this great seminar. It's a pleasure to be here. Sandra, thank you for the introduction. And actually, my presentation became shorter also because many things were said prior to me that are very, very useful for the key message that I want to try to pass to all of you today. Which is basically how do we apply, how do we use all those regulatory practices that we were talking before in a way that we can consistently transform the work of regulators in an efficient development of rules, and at the same time with a tool that can help you and help the users of the system to have a harmonized practice, a harmonized regulatory development, and at the same time facilitating the work that is being developed by regulators with compliance. So we saw Agnes' presentation prior to me, and I thought that was great because she brought a very important word for my presentation, which is legality. So good regulatory practice have to become a legal instrument and a legal tool to be used by national regulators. And the idea that we've been developing in the MDRC with our partners in governments and private institutions is to develop a checklist as a tool, as a desk-based tool to help national regulators developing their rules. But more than that, it's supposed to be a tool that assists national regulators while they are preparing a draft, while they are reflecting on the feasibility and the actual usefulness of a rule, and how it's going to be applied afterwards, and how the development of these rules could be drafted in a very consistent, compliant, and transparent way. So the MDRC developed this checklist, which I'm going to present very briefly, just show you the face of it, but I'm not going to go into the deep details of it. But the idea behind this tool is to make a bridge between the WTO TBT agreement and the international standards and all the international rules that you were looking and that you were trying to reflect in the national rules. So it's going to be a bridge to link the international rules to your national regulations. And more than that, it's supposed to be a standard system where you can basically rely on this in order to have security that you were developing a transparent rule, a consistent rule with international law, and that is going to fulfill the objectives and purpose of the rule that you are drafting. So the whole idea behind the checklist is to make something operational, to make a procedure that you can use on your daily basis. And obviously, when drafting the checklist, we thought that there are many national regulators in different standards and then with different stages of infrastructure and resources. So, for example, in Brazil, sometimes we have 3-4 national regulators for a whole subject. In other countries, we have 200 or 2,000. And the checklist is very complete, but it's supposed to fulfill the whole needs of the national regulators as a whole. So if you have more resources, it's going to be useful to you. If you don't have the resources, it's also going to be useful to you because you can look at the key messages and the key obligations and the key compliant issues that you should pay attention to when drafting a regulation. And it's very important to bear in mind that the whole idea behind the checklist is that national regulators are complying with international law while at the same time being consistent with the purpose of the rules they are drafting. And the way it works is to basically transform this procedure into a binding procedure. So it does have to be more than just a checklist for you to look for as a guideline, but it should be internalized within the national regulators structure. So within the authority of the national regulators authorities, there should be a way to bring this checklist into operational, legal, and binding procedure that you, when you are following the checklist and you are obliged to follow that checklist, then you are automatically also being compliant with good regulatory practice, because the idea is that when you draft the rule, you are being cautious with the details you have to look for. You are paying attention to the international standards, you are paying attention to the WTO TBT agreement obligations, and this can be auditable through out the period that you are drafting the rule and even afterwards. So when the checklist is internalized within the National Regulators Authority and becomes part of the structure of the national authority and becomes an obligation for the national authority to follow the checklist, then you are bringing much more transparency and security to users and also to the government that you are following the good regulatory practice. So I'm going to show you just a hint of the checklist so you can have an idea of what I'm talking about. And this is a table where we are looking for the main disciplines, the main core issues of the checklist, and then you have specific obligations to fulfill and to check if they are in accordance with the TBT agreement. We are providing the legal grounds behind the checklist. And one important issue is that to see if the discipline type, the first column of the table is the core issue that national regulators could take into consideration on a first glance. So when drafting technical regulations, are we complying with national treatment? So are we making the rules equal in terms of obligations to national and foreigners? Are we preparing those rules in a very transparent way with public consultancy procedures, giving time and space for private and public stakeholders to participate, foreign and nationals, for example? Are we providing the use and benchmarking international standards for those subjects, and how these international standards are being benchmarked and how they are being applied in the rules that you are drafting? And so the whole idea is to make the good regulatory practices and the general principles and standards that you are looking today and looking yesterday in the previous sessions and working with on a daily basis to become operational. There are standard operational procedures that we are developing at the MDRC to help national regulators, to assist national regulators in working together to how to make the checklist operational and at the same time to not to create difficulties when drafting national regulations. So, for example, when you look at the checklist, you may look at the questions that you are trying to answer, and in order to be more efficient and to be quicker for a regulator to go through those questions, every time is going to draft a regulation, it can be time consuming. So we are providing assistance also in how to operationalize this in a very standard way. And this would also assist national regulations during the daily activities. But I think the key issue here is to bring the idea that we have to make the international standards operational. We have to make international standards practicable and applicable. And the checklist supports national regulatory authorities to do this, to make it applicable in a very transparent way and compliant. But the best way to make this happen is to bring this kind of checklist within the structure of the national regulators structure and make it obligatory for them to follow the checklist and to follow the list in order to understand if the rules that they are drafting are actually being compliant with international standards and with the WTO TBT agreement and other applicable regulations, international regulations for that matter. And so that's the main core business of the issue of the checklist. I wish I could go through the details of it. I know we don't have time for that, but I'm going to leave also my contacts in case you need want to discuss a little bit. Perhaps in the Q&A we can also go a little bit further on that, Sandra. I don't know what you think about it, and we could go through equivalence and other kinds of items that are being discussed here in the checklist.
Marina, thank you very much, and really thank you for condensing all this information in such a short time. And probably, I mean, what definitely as MDRC project we are committed to is to share this list and also to make it available as part of the subsequent MDRC capacity building throughout 2023. So this is an instrument that we have developed, as you were mentioning, to support the regulators globally as to ensure that they are in full compliance with all these international obligations that all the countries that are signatories of the TBT agreement are under. And what it is really very relevant is how it is becoming more evident and more publicly evident, the much better understanding that the regulators do currently have in regards of the role that they do play to make devices available, not only from the sanitary perspective, but also from the trade perspective. And the checklist is part of what we have understood as an element to help that coming through by developing regulations that are in full compliance with these ones is definitely a mechanism that is going to be helping the regulators to ensure availability of products that comply with the highest safe and quality requirements that are mandatory at a country level. So, Marina, thank you very much. We do not have any further questions in the Q&A or in the chat box. So we will leave it in here, and we will continue the conversation as MDRC project in the forthcoming weeks and months. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And with these, now we're going to be getting into one before the last sections of our agenda today. So I'm going to be passing the microphone to Stephen Bibes, who is going to be helping us to moderate the section on international standards as a base for developing regulations. So Stephen, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra, and good afternoon and good morning to all. My name is Stephen Bibes with the
Stephen,
MD. Yes?
I'm sorry for interrupting. We are hearing an echo at your end. If you could try to check and see to make it easier for the interpreters.
Is there still an echo now?
Yes, it is.
I will disconnect and reconnect. Just a minute.
Okay, thank you. So even though we are like 3 years working through this digital environment, it still continues to present challenges every now and then. So thank you for your understanding, and we will have Stephen joining shortly. Okay, you're back.
Sandra, is there still an echo?
No, now
Okay.
it is perfect. Thank you very much.
Very good. Apologies for that. And thank you and everyone. My name is Stephen Bibes with the MDRC project team. I work at AdvaMed, and together with the American National Standards Institute, ANSI, and the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, and our many public and private sector partners on the implementation of the MDRC, we work around the world and really now have an exciting focus on the MDRC work streams with Africa. It is my pleasure to moderate this session, where our goal is to illuminate the role of international standardization in support of good regulatory practices medical device regulatory convergence, medical device regulatory reliance and agility, and all in support of a strengthened global medical device regulatory system and supply chain that minimizes unnecessary bottlenecks to life-saving medical technologies. And these are important during normal times and critical during global health emergencies. So I'm pleased to moderate this panel, which has the participation of the following individuals: Jessica Roop with the American National Standards Institute, ANSI; Ruben Jazor of the African Regional Standards Organization, ARSO; Michael Bromley, who is the Standards Attaché for Africa with the U.S. Foreign Commercial Service based in South Africa; Alexandre Dodou of the Ghana Standards Authority, GSA; Titus Oyu of the Kenya Bureau of Standards, KEBS; and Mapaseka Gumbi of the South African Bureau of Standards. And maybe I can just set the stage and note that international standardization is a global system that runs parallel to that of the WHO, the WTO, the MDRC, and global industry. And there's a whole international infrastructure that develops and maintains hundreds of thousands of technical documents that underpin virtually every aspect of modern society. This system maintains these technical documents as common international tools, meter sticks, if you will, but at pace with changes in both technology and in regulatory science and best practices. But perhaps similar to the work of the WTO and WHO, this work does not just happen top-down somewhere else, such as Geneva. These are bottom-up systems that require the engagement of all stakeholders from the bottom up. So we're going to begin with Jessica's presentation from ANSI, which is going to provide a brief, high-level overview of some of the major elements of the international standard system, which then sets the stage for the following presenters. I will just note that no one really plans on getting into international standards. Even those who work in standards bodies, they did not go and study standardization as a degree or a major. We all started as engineers or international people or regulatory people, and you kind of find out about standards along the way, but you come to realize just what a fundamental role it has in underpinning good regulatory practices independent of the sector, regulatory efficacy, regulatory convergence, but also in minimizing technical barriers to trade and good regulatory practices. And so we really wanted to take this panel to connect the information that has been relayed yesterday and earlier today with the work of everyone in the audience, and really kind of map out what are the major elements of international standardization, what's the role of the national standards body. And in the subsequent training we'll have in 2023, we will take an even deeper dive into the specific work of the standards committees that pertain directly to medical technologies. So we have Jessica Roop on the screen. She's with us, and I connected with her yesterday. She relayed to me that her voice has left her this week and her doctor has advised her not to stress it. So I am going to, she asked and I complied with her request to present her presentation for her. I will be her voice today, and she will correct me in the chat if I'm speaking out of line. But what I can say is that, we work closely with ANSI, not only on the MDRC project, but we are strong supporters of the role that ANSI has as the national standards body of the United States in coordinating the national standards conformity assessment system as the US member body to ISO and IEC. And also a long time ago, longer than I would like to relay, I am a former employee of ANSI. So I've probably given different forms of this presentation at one time or another. So Jessica, please feel free in the chat to correct me if need be. So with that, I'm going to switch to the presentation here. And Sandra, if you could be kind to advance the slides, or Leticia. And that's Jessica. And of course, at the end, we provide her contact information. You can follow up with any questions for her. She works in the international policy area at ANSI in Washington, DC. Next slide, please. Key terms that we'll refer to today are standards, technical regulations, and conformity assessment. And these were touched upon yesterday in the WTO TBT context, but maybe relaying that we can think of laws or legislation as primary legislation that enacted by parliaments, legislatures, and technical regulations can kind of be thought of secondary legislation that fleshes out the many details regarding a particular area, mandatory requirements, technical regulations that a legislature would not be able to get into. Standards can kind of be thought of as tertiary legislation, that they're not mandatory themselves, but they are developed in conjunction with public and private sector partners, and then they are referred to and used by regulatory authorities and industry to advance regulatory means. Next slide, please. And in the work of the development of standards, there's a term that comes up often, which is consensus. And consensus means, and you have the relevant stakeholders participating in the technical committees of the standards developing organizations. And you don't necessarily need unanimity, but you have more than a majority. And so the different standards developing organizations have their respective rules, be it ISO, IEC, or others, on how to achieve a consensus on a particular document and the standard. And the standards themselves are in maintenance cycles similar to technical regulations, as we discussed yesterday. Next slide, please. I won't spend too much time on this slide other than noting that the World Trade Organization has, as within the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement under Article 2.4, the requirement that the 164 members of the World Trade Organization use international standards as a basis for national technical regulations. And you've got the other elements under the WTO TBT agreement that pertain to notification of draft and final technical regulations and standards, and having a principle of non-discrimination versus the location of the business, and a reasonable time to implement. Next slide, please. The guiding principles of the WTO TBT agreement, as we touched on briefly yesterday, are transparency, openness, impartiality, effectiveness and relevance, flexibility, consensus, performance-based criteria, coherence, due process, technical assistance, that the standards process be timely, and that the participation be balanced. These are all principles that the WTO TBT has endorsed regarding the development of international standards. Next slide, please. The WTO TBT Annex 3 is the code of good practice for the preparation, adoption, and application of standards. And its key provisions include that standards should not act as technical barriers to trade. There should be a preference for international standards. There should be avoiding of duplication, of overlap, and a striving for consensus within the development of the documents. Standards developers should publish a work program as an analog to what's done on the regulatory side. Public comment periods should be allowed 60 days on the standards themselves, and also comments should be taken into consideration. And I note that just in the example of the United States, ANSI has accepted the Code of Good Practice on behalf of its standards developing organizations, and that I believe the majority, if not all, of the ISO and IEC members have also accepted the Code of Good Practice for their respective countries. Next slide, please. Within the Code of Good Practice, there are the following substantive provisions that pertain to the development of standards. I note just some of them here. Clause F relays that the use international standards should be used. International standards should be used as a basis, except where inappropriate or ineffective, and that means international standards should be used as a basis for national standards. And then the TBT goes beyond that to say that they should be used as a basis for technical regulations. Clause G play a full part in standards development of relevant international standardizing bodies, and so this is the commitment of the national standards bodies and members of the WTO to engage in international standardization. Clause F is making every effort to avoid duplication of work of other standardizing bodies, whether they be national, regional, continental, or international. Clause I is the preference for performance-based product requirements over design-based or descriptive characteristics. Clauses J and K relate to the publication of a work program every 6 months by the standards bodies. Clause L, M, and N require and encourage and allow public comment period on standards for at least 60 days. So that, again, you see that you've got the normal regulatory process, the development of technical regulations, and through the Code of Good Practice, all of the elements that apply to the standards bodies in the development of the standards themselves. And then Clause O is to promptly publish standards once adopted. Next slide, please. International standards should meet societal and market needs and not be developed to act as technical barriers to trade. And standards that meet the WTO TBT principles are international, regardless of the organization that developed them. And we mentioned already the Code of Good Practice, the TBT Agreement, Annex 3. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Just one example from the United States in that, a normal example for a national standards body such as ANSI is that they maintain technical committees pertaining to the different subjects, including medical technologies. And they often maintain also what are called mirror committees that map to the relevant international technical committees, be it from ISO, IEC, or other international standards developing organizations. And ANSI within the United States has its own system for accrediting the standards developing organizations, of which there are over 200. Next slide, please. So one of the significant international standards developing organizations is ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, which is a non-governmental organization, although some of its member national standards bodies are government entities. It was established in 1947. It's based in Geneva, and its membership model is one country, one vote, is the way that it's structured under ISO. Next slide, please. And here you have a map of the participation across the continent in ISO. You can see that between member bodies and correspondent members, virtually the entirety of the continent is engaged in the ISO activities. Next slide. There's a sister organization called the International Electrotechnical Commission, the IEC, also based in Geneva, also not-for-profit, founded in 1906. And the scope of its international standardization is electrotechnical devices, which is a fancy way of saying devices that use electricity. And its members are often the same bodies, but they are in the context of the IEC called national committees. Next slide, please. And here we just have a few slides that show the participation of a few countries from the continent engaging in international standardization of ISO and IEC. This slide, and it designates the participating or observer status, the number of publications, the work program, and I'm not going to go into great detail here. All of this information is available online. Next slide, please. This is similar information from Kenya, similar information from South Africa. And we are not going to spend much time today on conformity assessment, other than, as was noted, it's the whole methodology of demonstrating how requirements are complied with. And one portion of conformity assessment is a whole school of activity, which is accreditation. The accreditation bodies accrediting the national laboratories and testing laboratories and inspection bodies and certification bodies. And that's not the scope of our presentation today, but we include it here as a hook to following training that we may do on both accreditation and conformity assessment. Next slide, please. And here's just a single map that shows the different standards. I think it's important to note that the relevant international standards for conformity assessment are developed by ISO and IEC in the 1700 series. For example, ISO IEC, the standard ISO IEC 17011 is the criteria for the accreditation of conformity assessment bodies. 17025 is the standard that's used for the accreditation of laboratories. 17065 is the international standard used for the accreditation of product certifiers. Again, we're not going to go into great depth here, but just to place it as a placeholder for future capacity building that we will do on conformity assessment. Next slide, please. And I think it's important to emphasize the role that standards have. It's often easy to think that it's someone else somewhere else developing the standards, and it really is a bottom-up effort. They don't write themselves. And so global industry working with regulators participate in the standards development processes. And this is encouraged and codified by the relevant organizations, not just the WTO, but even when you look at the IMDRF Essential Principles document, it gets into how national regulatory authorities should be working together with other private sector stakeholders to develop the relevant standards that can underpin their regulatory frameworks and technical regulations. Next slide, please. And likewise, on the conformity assessment side, if standardization is setting the rules and making sure that the proper regulatory and technical criteria are in place, conformity assessment is the whole activity of leveraging, really operationalizing regulatory reliance. You cannot, repeated testing and repeated certification do not improve the quality or regulatory compliance of a medical device. And so the goal around the world, and really one of the objectives of global regulatory convergence, is getting to the objective of one standard, one test accepted everywhere, to avoid that a single device need to be tested or recertified or re-reviewed multiple times. And so we're looking at how we can leverage international standards, leverage international conformity assessment as tools to operationalize regulatory reliance and recognition. And particularly when there are various national initiatives to promote national production of medical devices, it's also essential that the small and medium-sized manufacturers of medical devices have components and inputs themselves that are globally harmonized. Otherwise, they will not be able to manufacture the devices, whether they're supplying the local market or looking to export as well. So it's important not just at the final device level, but also for the inputs to medical technologies. Next slide, please. Here's some links to resources for some of the organizations that were mentioned. Next slide, please. And that concludes Jessica's presentation. Maybe I can take a moment. I know we're compressed on time, but maybe I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and transition right into the next speaker, and then we'll take questions at the end if that's okay. So with that, I'm going to thank you, Jessica, for providing us that presentation and for giving me the opportunity to present to it. I'd now like to invite Ruben Jazor of the African Regional Standards Organization to enlighten us on how the work of ARSO helps implement standards across the continent of Africa and how that may be helpful to work that we're doing in the medical technology sector. Ruben?
Thank you very much. I'll give a very short overview. Perhaps because I came in a bit late, I'll just give you a short overview of what we've been doing, the kind of standards and how the work started off. So allow me to just project something that is very brief to demonstrate the project we're currently running. And I have to say that this project was prompted in part by the COVID pandemic, and that made us react to that pandemic by looking at what exactly the continent needs to address the issues that we are facing. So ARSO is an intergovernmental body of the African Union that is a membership body where the national standards bodies represent their national governments. So basically, the national standards body acts as a gateway to make sure that the countries are represented. And that means that as a gateway, they invite the stakeholders from the member states. Now, we have structures to do standards, as you may know. And Stephen, you said you are in ANSI. So this is a typical structure where you have the General Assembly, and then you have a council, which is very similar to what you have in ISO. And then we have the Standards Management Committee, that's the Technical Management Board. If you look at ISO, from there, then we have the technical committees, under which we have subcommittees and working groups, after which we could have task forces. Now, the model we use is very simple, that when we need very unique standards, we have a process that we follow where we cannot get international standards. The priority that we use is that when there's an international standard, we adopt it. We look through it, then we recommend it for member states to adopt. We don't adopt the standards as ARSO, but we adopt them. We adopt through notification to the member states that this international standard is sufficient to address the issues at any stage that we are looking at, and then we recommend them for adoption at the national level, so that if it is Kenya, if it is Tanzania or South Africa, they adopt this standard as national standards, by having the prefix of their national standards like Kenya, which is KS, or Tanzania TZS and ISO. And then that way it's an identical ISO standard that is to be used. And I'm saying this because you'll see that the majority of the standards that we have actually adopted as African standards are international standards from ISO, IEC, STM, and other bodies. These projects, as I said, came in handy when we were looking at the COVID pandemic, that is 2020, when most of the place, I mean, if you're looking at Europe, USA, Africa, there was a lockdown. And therefore, we needed materials and devices that would address the pandemic. And in that time, we got assistance from the Afrexim Bank, the International Islamic Trade Finance Corporation, and also the Arab Africa Trade Bridges Program. And the project is called Harmonization of Standards for Pharmaceutical and Medical Devices in Africa, and initially looking at promoting quality and safety of the medicines and medical devices imported or produced on the continent. So in that, we had 3 committees initially, looking at medical devices and equipment, pharmaceuticals and medicinal products, then African traditional medicine, and the technical regulations subcommittee to look at the regulations, because this is a regulated sector, and therefore we need to look at regulations that govern this. So the first phase was the harmonization of the standards. Second was conformity assessment, and we had phases, the immediate and short-term phase. That's the first phase, and then the long-term phase for standards, conformity assessment, and regulatory harmonization. You may be surprised that we are talking about the regulatory harmonization, but we are looking at a regulated sector, and we needed to have a number of guidelines that will assist the member states to come up with regulations that are harmonized in a way that will allow for the products to be traded across the borders. So we have the three committees, the one that deals with the medical devices and equipment. If you look at the kind of equipment that they deal with, including the electromedical devices, equipment and devices, and that in line with that, you'll find that most of the standards we used are from the IEC. And then we have others like dentistry, oral hygiene, anesthetic and respiratory equipment, implant for surgery, prosthetics, surgical equipment. Quite a number of these, you find that a big number of the standards are from ISO, and then you find those fields where there's cooperation between ISO and IEC, and therefore we had to get those standards from both sides. So the countries participating, currently actually there are 16, we increased, the number of experts has also expanded. These are the leaderships. Basically the leadership for the two committees that you'll be seeing came from Malawi. Then we are the one on pharmaceuticals and medicinal products. These had to deal with issues of sterilization and disinfection, laboratory medicine, pharmaceuticals, then medicinal products and biotechnology. This, of course, again, we have increased the membership. We are 16 countries. Then there's the one that deals with the traditional medicine. I think perhaps because it's not well understood, but you'll find that still it also has aspects of medical devices and equipment which are used in traditional medicine. So all those have to be guided by standards that we come up with. Then we have the technical regulations part, which is very interesting in the sense that we are looking at elaboration of technical regulations for pharmaceuticals, medicinal products, medical devices, and equipment. Now, we don't directly develop technical regulations, but we develop guidelines which assist countries to adopt best practices. And in this, you find that we have quite a big number of countries participating, they are listed. And in this one, we were, like the leadership came from, is still from South Africa. And then we have also the secretary from Nigeria. Now, this is the one that actually dealt with quite a bit of the aspects that needed to be done, whether it is the devices themselves, what are the best practices? For example, which kind of standards do we adopt to assist with the best practices? If it's quality management, we know the ISO IC 138 45. And then we have guidelines that assist with the procurement aspects. So we've done quite a bit of standards in this sense. And when we look at what we are looking at having in the long term, we are looking at having good manufacturing practices for pharmaceuticals and biomaterials, good manufacturing practices for medical devices, guidelines for pharmacovigilance, scientific guidelines for medicinal products for human use and all that. These are quite a number of things that we are currently working on. Now, what is the emphasis on our case? The emphasis is that we are looking at international standards as the basis for most of the work that we are doing. And if you look at the bulk of the standards that we did, over 200 standards that we have promoted for adoption by member states, these are international standards derived from ISO and IEC, and a number of others that are also derived from ASTM and European standards. Now, the sense in that is that since we needed to fast track the availability of the medical devices and equipment and medicinal products, we needed to use what is currently existing, and that has gone through the international best practices, which would assure us that we can source or manufacture these products in the continent following standards that have been proven over time, and they are already in use very widely. Now, that would overcome challenges of trading these products across the borders, remembering that some of our countries have small economies that cannot afford to establish manufacturing facilities that would make economic sense in terms of trading them to make profits for the organizations involved. For that reason, we find that if you are using international standards, then it is possible that you can manufacture looking at a bigger market or a bigger group of countries based on the current existing trade arrangements, whether it is COMESA, EAC, or SADC, and therefore you're able to trade across those countries. Then if you're using those international guidelines or standards, again, you're able to come together as countries and pool resources to actually make specific imports that make sense to big manufacturers who may not want to sell a few or a few items that would not really make profits for them or make sense to transport those kinds of small quantities across the borders. So for that purpose, I think we have used the best practices so far to ensure that we establish guidelines that assist our countries to participate in the manufacturing as well as in the importing of essential medical devices and equipment during the pandemic and in the long term during normal times to address the healthcare needs of our countries. I wish to stop at this point, and if there are questions, we will welcome them. But I also note that, of course, the other colleagues from Africa are in place, and therefore the questions we may wish to answer them at the same time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruben. Very helpful for that high-level overview, and we look forward to sharing that information with the participants and more greatly familiarizing ourselves with the work that RSO is doing with its member national standards bodies across the continent, with the focus on medical devices and international harmonization in the continental context. So with that, I would like to transition over to Michael Bromley, who is the Standards Attaché for Africa with the U.S. Foreign Commercial Service based in South Africa. Mike.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you. Here, give me 1 minute. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can you see everything on my? Am I sharing my screen and you can hear me okay?
I can hear you fine. I'm not. There you go. It's in the process of loading. There we go. Yes.
Okay, excellent. All right, thank you so much. It's an absolute honor to be here, and so great to follow RSO. And of course, I want to go through the list. Yeah, Jessica and Marina, Michelle and Agnes. I'm going to be kind of echoing many of the things that you've heard today. But I think this will be a little bit unique, and I'm going to keep it short as well. I'm going to be able to share more of a trade perspective. I know there's a lot of technical perspective in the participants and attendees, but this is just going to be kind of more of a high level trade perspective. So thank you again. My name is Mike Bromley. I'm a commercial officer located at the U.S. Mission in South Africa. I cover a couple of different commercial portfolios, but most importantly and relevant for today is the standards attaché folder that I carry for Sub-Saharan Africa. And let me go to the next slide here. Just a very brief overview so you know who I am and where we're coming from. The commercial service has one main function, and it's to help U.S. businesses export into Africa. And I just want you to see our reach. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because I would welcome any interaction that we can have. I would love to work with any national regulatory authorities and standards bodies, and any way that we can help promote international standards and harmonization. So we have offices in pretty much every major US city. And then more importantly, we have a regional hub here in South Africa. And we have commercial service offices where that's US Department of Commerce in all of the places with the red, white, and blue flags. And then of course, we work closely with our State Department econ colleagues in a lot of the other areas. That doesn't mean we don't travel there, we do as well. And those are, I just want to mention that. So foreign commercial service, again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Basically, as I said, we help US businesses export. Most relevant to this discussion today is probably, I would have to say, resolving export problems, which may fall into commercial diplomacy and trade barriers. Preventing trade barriers is probably the most relevant. So again, if you have any questions, happy to take them at the end, as Stephen indicated. So a basic introduction to the standards program. It's an initiative that the Department of Commerce has started, and we're trying to have regional standards attachés in every country. And again, I have my contact details on the side of each slide, as well as a couple of links, but please feel free to email me, and I'd love to hear more and learn about ways that we can work together. So again, primarily this is going to be, we interact with US government agencies, of course, but more importantly, foreign regulators and standards bodies. And we're promoting international standards. I think that this is a newer program for the continent in Africa. We've had other attachés in other regions of the world, of course, but it's starting here. I think there's concern that we're just promoting US standards, and that is not the case. It's harmonization and international standards. Again, preventing technical barriers to trade are our priorities here. So I want to go to the next slide as well, but well, I'll highlight a couple of last ones. Promoting WTO standards, which fits in really well with yesterday's presentation from the WTO. And of course, we work with US government, private industry partners, and can provide training and workshops and partnerships with Standards Alliance, for example. And then of course, supporting the use of good regulatory practices, which was also discussed in excellent detail today earlier. So regarding, again, I cover all standards, and I can't go into specific examples of open cases that we're working on. Just to discuss medical device technical barriers to trade. The COVID-19 pandemic, as everybody knows, really set the whole world off guard, and PPP and medical devices are still being prevented from reaching doctors and patients. And this is life-saving technology. And we've seen it where, as I mentioned later in the slide here, there's an 18-month life cycle on medical devices. And so by the time there's like version 2 and version 3, better technology available, but version 2 still hasn't passed the regulatory process yet to enter the market. And that's something that I'll be honest, we have seen on the continent here. And we're going to talk a little bit, as you've already heard, about a lot of methods, like from Marina about GRP checklist and a lot of other tools that you might be able to use. But this is just kind of bringing it back together again and summarizing. But these non-alignments occur when national regulatory authorities develop unique country-specific regulations instead of using a basis of international harmonized standards and regulatory practices. I already mentioned the bottleneck, but I just wanted to mention that the importance of using this as a basis. And I think WTO and World Health Organization as well earlier, Agnes covered this. A slight diversion, and I know Stephen mentioned that he's going to cover it in following webinars, perhaps, but talking about accreditation bodies, this is another interesting aspect of medical devices specifically. And I think I'm trying to remember who said it earlier. I can't off the top of my head. I believe it was Agnes mentioned in the question and answer section about separating medical devices and pharmaceuticals, and how important that is to not try to come up with any type of, this nets all type of solutions, because that will run into a lot of problems. So this is all specific to medical devices. But accreditation, and this applies to the devices as well, becomes taxing, and that is a pun. We've seen accreditation bodies basically try to do money grabs with requiring redundant accreditation processes in different parts of the world. And I'm not just talking about Africa. Please don't get me wrong. I'm not picking on the country. A lot of the examples I'm using are from other parts of the world. And these are, global accreditation bodies really should be considered more of a commercial activity, not a public authority regulatory practice, so to speak. And I think that there's been some regulations where you see, for example, at the bottom here, accreditation can only occur in the member state of the conformant assessment body. And then they're not recognizing recognition of other accreditations. ILAC comes to mind. And I'll stop there because it is a side topic, and I think Stephen will go into it at a later date. So what are kind of our message and mission coincides very well with the speakers over the last 2 days. As the World Health Organization said earlier today, and I really liked what Agnes said about reliance does not mean dependency. And it's so true, because there's so many. You can rely on international standards, which are implemented by so many different technical committees and organizations that are involved. ISO, for example, SOBS in South Africa was a founding member. So I think that the recommendation, anyways, WHO recommends implementation of regulatory resilience models, which are fairly specific, I believe, to medical devices. And it will give you a good example of how it will impact your market. And then, of course, using international standards as a basis for national technical regulations. And then WTO yesterday I hope I'm not missing a member number there. I apologize if I am. But of the current members who all agree that international standards should be the basis for all national standards and regulatory development. More importantly, the World Trade Organization Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement is an international law, and the member states are then nationally obligated to comply with those. This commitment, again, is then reinforced through the AFCFTA. And again, this falls into global reporting initiatives and other compliances. But this is also echoed by another international organization, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which encourages the use of best practices through good regulatory practices, which was covered very well by the checklist Marina provided earlier. So what needs to happen from a United States mission perspective? And again, this is on an international standards harmonization, not just pushing our issues. National regulatory authorities are recommended to implement and make mandatory the GRP checklists that we talked about before. It's a most cost-effective and efficient methodology to accomplish international standards and the goal I mentioned below. And national regulatory authorities are encouraged to participate in the development of international standards via technical committees. And that's at the national level, of course, as many of you know. And then use regulatory impact assessments regarding medical devices, very importantly. And then again, I think the overall goal should be owning zero national standards that were not based on an international standard. And I think Arso even mentioned this before me, which was great. And also I added this recognition of prior harmonization. On another continent before I came here, there was a technical barrier to trade regarding standards that was identified. And it was very interesting that I think there's misunderstanding with some regulators of how harmonization works. And it's as Stephen just mentioned, you know, if it conforms to WTO, TBT, you know, obligations, it is now an international standard. And so there was an example, I can provide some details on it because I think it's interesting, again, from the trade perspective. There is an electrical standard for implementation in a Latin American country. And basically, it was an ANSI standard. And the company was from the United States and complied with that. But the regulatory authority decided that they wanted that they would no longer recognize ANSI standards and only ISO standards, which were already harmonized and identical. But they created a technical barrier to trade, and the U.S. business could no longer do business there. So I think that's a good hands-on example of some of the importance of recognizing the harmonization process. And I just want to mention at the end, you know, again, going back to the highlights that we just covered on the previous slide, implementing those things will prevent TBTs and non-alignment from even occurring. And that will help life-saving medical technology reach patients that are in need, and that's still happening. And just again, briefly, I have a lot of contact details up, but please don't hesitate to reach out. And I would love to work more with everyone here. All right, thank you so much, Stephen. Really appreciate the time.
Thank you very much, Mike. And we really appreciate the efforts of the U.S. Department of Commerce across the board, including with the MDRC project. I think it's important to emphasize that we're working in the construct and the architecture of the MDRC. We're working with not just the Department of Commerce, but with the Ministry of Trade of all of the MDRC partner countries. So in Kenya, in South Africa, in Ghana, with the AFCFTA Secretariat, and across Latin America and Southeast Asia, the work includes not just Tier 2 with the medical device regulatory authorities, but the Ministries of Trade. And each one is appropriately looking at how they can help the exports from their respective countries. And in the context of the MDRC, we're looking to identify the bottlenecks independent of where they happen to occur and independent of the direction of the trade flows. The medtech supply chain is global, and we're looking to eliminate every possible barrier that's unnecessary. And I would note it wasn't a technical barrier to trade, but it was one example, I think, of successful regulatory convergence where the US FDA, has transitioned away from its US unique quality management system standard and in line with ISO 1345. And so it's, as we work with all of the member countries, that includes the United States, and a continuing process of regulatory and standards convergence. So thank you very much, Mike. With that, I'm going to transition over to Alexandre Dudu of the Ghana Standards Authority, GSA. Alexandre, are you with us?
Stephen, I'm afraid that he has not joined yet, so we could probably continue.
Okay, very good. I'll move on in sequence, and if he can join, we'll add him on at the end. So with that, I'm going to transition over to Titus for you with the Kenya Bureau of Standards, KEBS. Titus? Hi.
Hello, I get you. Let me try to also share my screen.
Thank you very much.
Are we able to see?
Yes. Are you able to put it into presentation mode?
All right, just in a minute.
Thank you. Perfect.
Okay. My name is Titus Otieno Oyo. I work for Kenya Bureau of Standards in Nairobi. I'm sorry I was not able to join this BACA meeting early enough. This is because currently I'm undertaking a training in risk management at the Kenya School of Government in Mombasa, at the coastal town of Mombasa. But however, I was able, through the communication of Sandra, to connect and of course ensure that I'm here today. And of course to be ready to listen to the other presenters, which has been very meaningful. And I have to say, it's a learning process and I've learned a lot. I want to briefly present, but of course taking cognizance of what has been presented by my predecessors through the regulatory aspects of it and every other thing that has been said, including what was talked about by Tobias Ololo. This is just about general regulatory practices in Kenya, a case of medical devices. And I'll start, sorry, by saying that we normally does it in Kenya so as to be able to safeguard health, safety, and environment. Government of Kenya promulgates regulatory requirements for manufacture and sale of medicinal devices, tools, and services, including those that have been imported. They are also stipulated through various acts, rules, and regulations by different ministries, of course, departments and agencies under the government of Kenya. And I think most of these had been talked about yesterday. There are also acts, rules, and regulations that is done taking cognizance of the relevant WTO agreement. Again, I want to appreciate my predecessors having delved into this in detail. There are certain considerations that we are taking into consideration, or other aspects that we have to consider when we develop regulatory measures in Kenya, and they include minimum requirements, and those minimum requirements should have minimum compliance cost, because the cost of implementing regulations can sometimes escalate and become very prohibitive. Equally, they should be beneficial to the society. And lastly, they should be they should be in tandem with the laws of the country, that is the laws of Kenya. Further, they should be made to and enforced in a transparent manner. And I think the previous speakers dealt on this also. They should treat all fairly and equitably, all members of the society fairly and equitably. They should be drafted in clear and simple language for purposes of understanding. And lastly, they should be flexible for amendments, revisions, if required due to changed circumstances. Having said that, then I would say that in Kenya, when it comes to issues of medical devices, the ministry in charge is the Ministry of Industrialization, Trade and Enterprise. And of course, under there is also what we call the Directorate of Foreign Trade that develops these regulations. We have got relevant regulatory agencies, including Kenya Bureau of Standards and Farmers and Process Board. And therein, what comes out, what had been discussed yesterday was legal notice number 78, which was enacted in 2005, and I think has since been severally revised to reflect the current realities. Allow me not to go into this because these are academic,
But I have to again say that when developing regulations in Kenya, background studies have to be taken, and some of the meaningful questionnaires developed for purposes of transparency and ensuring that we don't come up with regulations that are not tandem with the current economic and, of course, other environmental realities that may be existing. Some of the triggers for this, for us to be able to update them if they're already existing or they are not there, are risks assessment results, update or revision of code of conduct. We have got aspects of internal audit findings, publicized failure in the same or similar industry, like we had one medical device that was imported from a foreign country that came into the country. But unfortunately, because of its use, the way it was actually handed over, it actually caused an accident that now resulted in a publicized failure that has made us to start looking at that and then come up with mechanisms to control. So publicized failure in the market can also make us go back and come up with regulations. Then there is business strategy, mergers, acquisitions, and other organization changes. Of course, there is aspect of geographic expansions. Let me not go into the goals, but I want to say that if you look at ISO is a non-governmental organization, but in Kenya, KEBS is a government organization, but it is affiliated to International Organization for Standardization, that is ISO, and of course IEC. So of the 164 members that you talked about, Kenya Bureau of Standards is one of them. We participate very actively in harmonization and development of international standards and, of course, national and regional standards. We also participate in quality control in the national and, of course, in the international arena. We issue certificates. We have certification scheme for products and systems. We also have to ensure that we implement regulation for purposes of consumer protection. This is actually the key person that we are trying to protect by coming up with these regulations. All of us know how standards have been developed, and I think we don't have to, again, delve into this for a very long time. But I have to say that through development of standards, technical committees are set up in Kenya, and those technical committees have the membership from the manufacturers, they have the membership from the consumers, government departments. We have got technologies, regulating authorities, testing laboratories, consultants, and so many others. So this is the basic constitution of what I would call a technical committee that is reflecting the international best practices as it is today. And all these people, when developing a project, they have to actually base their output on consensus. So the principle of consensus, as has been alluded to, is very important for us. We all know that standards have been accepted as the best accepted code of good practice of the TBT agreement, and that they are used widely in dispute resolutions whenever TBT issues arise between nations, and of course between two corporate bodies, if there is anything. They are widely circulated at draft stage, and when we undertake these documents for public circulation, that is the 2 months, 60 days, then they are also notified through WTO notification. So that is actually a process through which standards development in Kenya and WTO are actually linked. That is at the public review stage. This diagram actually represents in a nutshell what I'm talking about. And if you look at it, you'll get that there are meetings that are taking place through working groups. They come up with working group drafts. Those drafts are then circulated. Again, they are considered as comments are coming in. And then once accepted, they can be taken for final draft as national standards or adoption through the division of adoptions, or they can be taken, circulated to committee members for further comments, and like that. And that circulation, there is what we call connection to WTO. And of course, the other aspect is that it is widely circulated, and therefore it has got widest, if possible, for lack of a proper word, wider consensus built into it. Conformity assessment, my colleague has referred to it as the last level of regulation that should be there. Indeed, I do concur, but again, in Kenya, we have got through the Stars Act, that is 496, that also sets up the conformity assessment. They also offer third-party assurance based on well-defined schemes of testing and inspection. And of course, they also ensure adequacy in process quality control. These aspects are actually supported by, the conformity assessment in the country is supported by the laboratories. Kenya Bureau of Standards hosts a number of laboratories, what we refer to as reference labs. And of course, there are other accredited laboratories that are not necessarily within the Kenya Bureau of Standards laboratory schemes. They are also accredited and therefore are accepted as labs that can be used for purposes of conformity assessment. Do remember, we are talking of accreditation under the National Laboratory Accreditation Scheme according to ISO IEC 17025. And this brings in the good practice in terms of traceability and all that. In terms of notification practices, we have got criteria for notification that includes assessments of whether international standards exist on technical content and whether it is different from the others. If there is a difference, then it has to be notified. It has to be, again, properly brought out so that a good comparison can be enacted. It also has to be looked at in terms of impact of regulation on trade, or whether regulation deals with technical requirements or SPSS, and so on and so forth. So there are regulatory agencies that are responsible for this, for these aspects of conformity assessment. I don't have to go into the notification procedures because that is not actually the gist of the matter today. But let me say this, that for purposes of medical devices, Kenya Bureau of Standards has signed memoranda of understanding with the 10 countries and of course with the Pharmacy and Poisons Board for purposes of enhancing cooperation in one, standardization and conformity assessment. And then we also facilitate sharing of expertise and mutual trade. And we have got several MRAs with countries like Southern Sudan for purposes of trade facilitation. Through those particular, let me say, membership and partnership, we have got regional cooperation initiatives that we are also taking for purposes of ensuring that these particular products, wherever they come from or wherever we take them to, they actually still meet the basic international standards. We have establishments of the East African Community Regional Standardization Association with the following objectives. One, purposes of coordination and cooperation between countries in the standards and conformity assessment. Two, development of harmonized standards. Three, facilitating interregional trade. And lastly, promoting MRAs on conformity assessment. I would like to stop here, and maybe if there is something for us to be able to clarify, I'll be very glad to. Otherwise, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Titus, for the extraordinarily informative deck and presentation. And with your permission, we will make this a PowerPoint available together with the other ones on the project website as a part of this webinar series. And the participants can look through the information with more time. One request I would have, Titus, before we transition to the next speaker is if it's possible for you, while we go through the next presentation, to include in the link to the chat the contact information of @KEBS, whom interested parties can contact to get engaged in the technical standardization activities within KEBS. I think that would be very instructive and informative, at least for the Kenyan stakeholders, and we'll likewise make that request of the other NSBs as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's taken.
Okay, perfect. With that, I'm going to transition over to Mapaseka Kumbi of the South African Bureau of Standards, SABS. Mapaseka, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, colleagues. I'm going to try and share my presentation. Can you guys hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to go through this presentation. I'm Mapaseka Kumbi from the SABS, and I'm the responsible officer for the Medical Device Technical Committee. I'm not going to dwell too much into standards development, but just to take you guys on a quick overview of our committee structure and how we basically support the standards development in the region and within South Africa as well. So just a quick overview. First of all, I'm just going to speak of the strategic business plan of our technical committee, which is SABS TC 1039, which is the medical device committee, and it has the subcommittees as reflected on the screen here, which is SC1 for anesthetic and respiratory equipment, sterilization of healthcare products, that is SC2, and quality management and corresponding general aspects for medical devices. Now, when we look at the strategic business plan for our committee, so the main purpose is just to align the SABS technical committee work program with the business environment, and also to identify benefits of standardization, and also to identify priority projects in line with the business environment, and also to align the South African standards with international standards, and also to promote liaison between national institutions as well. So the technical committee currently has about 66 members, some of which are P members, mostly are P members, that is participating members, and some of them are just observing members. Unfortunately, I couldn't just break that down onto the presentation, but also just to highlight that we always strive for a balanced representation of our stakeholders, just to ensure that we have all the appropriate or relevant stakeholders in our technical committees. So currently the committees are made up of suppliers, suppliers of medical devices, manufacturers, associations, and the regulatory body, which is SAPRA. And when we go now onto the published standards, we have about 63 in total. And of this 63, only 14 are locally developed standards, which we call homegrown standards. Most are ISO standards, which are identical adoption. And some of them are EN standards, also an identical adoption of those international standards. And most of the standards actually cover surgical medical devices, syringes, medical gloves, sterilization of healthcare products, biological evaluation, and quality management, and anesthetics and respiratory equipment standards. We currently have 11 standards on the program of work, and this just makes up some of the standards that we've had to review. We review our published standards every 5 years. And some of them are actually the newly adopted standards. And to give an example, which falls under the subcommittee 2 under sterilization, it would be EN 1422, which is a sterilizer for medical purposes, ethylene oxide sterilizers, requirements and test methods. And also in published standards, there was mention of ISO 13485, which we've also adopted, and the risk assessment standard, which is ISO 14971. Now, when we look into the region, our participation is also at ARSO level. We are a participating member of ARSO Technical Committee 78, Medical Devices. And I think as earlier speakers have alluded to the harmonization project that has been going on in the region of standardization, particularly in medical devices. So I'm not going to dwell too much onto that, but we are involved in that work as well. And also as participating member in ARSO TC 70, ARSO TC 80 rather, for pharmaceutical and medicinal products. Now I'm going to go into the next slide, which now highlights the participation of our participation rather at ISO as a P member for sterilization of healthcare products, which now this maps to the local committee TC 1039 and also the subcommittee 2. And we hold an observing membership status for ISO TC 121 for anesthetic and respiratory equipment, which maps locally to the subcommittee 1 rather, sorry, and the P membership status of ISO TC 210, quality management and corresponding general aspects for medical devices, which also maps to SABS TC 1039. And I think this brings me to a very short presentation that I had prepared, and I believe a whole lot of the stuff in terms of standards development processes has already been covered by most of the speakers. And just one of the things that I would like to highlight is that we also try and align as much as possible to the ISO processes and policies. And locally, we are governed by our national norm, which is a document. When you look at it, outlines basically your general rules of engagement in terms of participation in our local committees. So this, you can basically say it's equivalent to your ISO code of conduct as well, and just the general rules that governs the SABS committee participation and representation. I think this brings me to the end of the presentation, Stephen. I didn't prepare a whole lot, and also considering that a lot of the stuff has already been covered, and also the 10 minutes time that I have to do my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mapaseka. Very informative. And a question for interested parties that wish to engage SABS in the technical committees that you referenced, should they just contact you?
Yes, they can send me, I'll put my email address on the chat box there. They can just contact me, and then we'll just take it from there for the South African stakeholders.
Thank you very much. Very much appreciate that. Very comprehensive and executive summary. And I see that we do have one question from Mercy Njunga that is more directed to Titus, but in the interest of time, I'm going to, as moderator's discretion, follow up with you, Mercy, offline and relay to you, information from the very constructive meetings we had with KEBS last week on that very subject. And then we look forward to engaging them also in the subsequent capacity building under the MDRC. So we will follow up with you offline. Thank you. So with that, apologies for running just slightly late. I'm going to pass it over to Dimakatso Matibe, who's the AMDF Vice Chair and also the head of the Medical Device Division at SAPRA. Dimakatso?
Okay, good day and good afternoon, colleagues. Hope you can hear me, Stephen. My voice is not well, so
sorry for that.
Yeah, but it's okay. And good afternoon to all the colleagues who had made their time to join us. From my side, I've been requested to speak to regulatory convergence, and also I'm representing SAPRA as well as I'm a vice chair of the Africa Medical Device Forum. So in this topic, I'm just going to speak to a few areas and only focus on regulatory convergence because my colleagues earlier, Agnes and other colleagues, have spoken to regulatory harmonization. So I didn't want to repeat what they have indicated. So I have focused the presentation mainly to regulatory convergence. Next slide, please. So we'll be looking at the mandate of the various national regulatory authority in relation to the convergence, regulatory convergence itself, the need of having to have regulatory convergence, and then the importance of stakeholder management and the efforts that has been made to date by organizations such as the AMDF, as well as the WHO, the MIDRF, which already have presented that are leading towards regulatory convergence. And then it's open for discussion. Next slide, Stephen. So if you look at the mandate of the national regulatory authorities across the world, is to ensure that there's access of medical devices, including IVDs, hence I said at the global or international level. And also, you know, we have to use lessons that we have learned during various emergencies, like in COVID-19, the pandemic. So hence the topic of regulatory convergence is been there for years, but now we bring it up again and we focus on that. When we're looking at the mandate of various national regulatory authority, we're looking at the safety, ensure that the product that are in their market, respective market, are of high quality and they're performing as intended and they are effective. And, you know, with regulatory convergence, we are trying not to make sure that we are not reinventing the wheel. What other regulatory authority has been done, if you refer to the communication shared earlier on the MIDRF, we don't reinvent the wheel, whether we are in Africa or we are in any other parts of the world. And when you're looking at the approaches that can be used by various national regulatory authorities, we're looking at harmonization, which was spoken a lot by my colleague from WHO, as well as my colleague from MIDRF. We're looking at convergence. My colleague had just finished speaking, various colleagues from various countries, Kenya, South Africa, has been talking to standardization. Next slide, please. So I just thought, let's speak about regulatory convergence and be purposeful about it. What is convergence and where does this word come from, so that we have clarity and we are able to separate that and have a clear understanding from other terminology. So regulatory convergence is coming together for a whole new thing, working together towards one common goal. And furthermore, if you look at the definition of what is regulatory convergence from the USFDA CDR side, it's a process whereby regulatory requirements across economies becomes more similar or aligned over time. I intentionally highlighted those areas as a result of gradual adoption of internationally recognized technical guidance documents and standard. And furthermore, it does not represent harmonization of laws and regulation for people to be able to move forward. And I have further indicated the difference between convergence as well as harmonization at the bottom. So when you're looking at harmonization, there is also an intention to harmonize the legislations so that people are following the same legislative framework for them to be able to put regulations in place. Next slide, please. So why is there a need for regulatory convergence? A lot of work has been done, as I indicated. It's not new. It's not a new terminology in a medical device or health sector, health product or medical product sector. There is a rapid access to health products and technology in this instance of speaking to medical device and including IVD. It assists with decision-making for the National Regulatory Authority, because if other organizations have put in place, for argument's sake, a guideline, we can adopt that guideline as per our legislative framework, or we can adapt it as it is and put it in place, and that will assist with decision-making of a particular national regulatory authority. And the convergence as well, it promotes capacity building, so that the national regulatory authority can prioritize their resource allocation within their national regulatory authority. If there are guidelines already in place, then we can take the resources and put it in another area and focus there. For example, post-marketing surveillance is an example. It also promotes networking and information sharing, data sharing amongst various regulatory authority. And also coordination and streamlining of processes. We've just spoken about standardization. So if we are all following the same standard, it becomes more coordinated and also more streamlined. Next slide, Steve. Thank you. And I think one of the most important thing in convergence is looking at stakeholder management. There are various stakeholders that we are working with. We have partners, and I'm now speaking on the AMDF side, that we work with towards harmonization, which is one of the strategic objectives of the Africa Medical Device Forum. We have to have a process of stakeholder management. We have to work on partnering with various partners, collaboration, engagement, networking, and also purposeful communication and coordination with other regulators. So we're looking at the National Regulatory Authority relating with or working together and partners with MRH, AMDF, IMDRF, WHO, and other stakeholders. And when I'm talking about partnership, an example of why we are in this meeting, it's because of the partnership that the various national regulatory authority in Africa will have with the MDRC. So this is what is helping to, to communicate the good regulatory practice that emphasizes the need as well as the importance of various topics that are out there. As I indicated, that the colleagues since yesterday were speaking about good regulatory practice, harmonization, and with partners, that's what assists to put such in place. Next slide, please. There has been a lot of work that is being done from the Africa Medical Device Forum, AMDF. So I just said in this slide, I will speak to the AMDF. I see that circle has moved. So AMDF is there at the bottom in the middle, where there is AMDF, the yellow one. So AMDF is a technical working group under the Africa Medical Device Regulatory Forum, and it's hosted jointly by the Secretariat under AUDA-NEPAD and the WHO, and it was announced in 2012. So if you look at there's a vision and mission of the Africa Medical Device, and that can be found in the AUDA-NEPAD website. So I have on the next slide indicated where you can find the vision and the mission of the Africa Medical Device Forum. So based on the topic at hand, I have selected various strategic objectives that speaks to regulatory convergence. We're looking at, I have selected 3, other ones are also applicable, but these are more prominent. We look at the advance and promote continental harmonization, mutual recognition, reliance of medical device regulation in all regional economic communities. Earlier, colleagues spoke about the SADC. We have the EAC that we're working together with so with the AMDF, it's not for regional economic, is the whole Africa as a whole, where we want to ensure that there is that recognition and reliance method, as well as the use of the guidelines. I'll speak to the work that has been done on the next slide. We're looking at the next strategy number 5. It's building technical capacity of national regulatory agency in medical devices, IVD regulatory framework. If we look at what has been published, and earlier the colleagues were also speaking about the MDRC app, which is the inspection. If an inspection is done in another country, then we can take that information and do recognition. We don't have to go to that country. I think there was a question as well on that, on how Africa is also going to recognize the audit that's being done by other regulatory authorities. So we're looking at MDSF as AMDF to use that. And then the next strategic objective that is also relevant to convergence is coordinate and facilitate implementation of joint regulatory activities. I've spoken about inspection. One of the areas is to look at the dossier review that has been done in other African regulatory authority, and that could be applicable to other national regulatory authority, as well as recognizing other regulatory authority outside of Africa. We're looking at post-marketing surveillance, which will be one of the next coming activities that we'll be looking at regarding sharing of data on adverse events, that it makes it easier that or transparent, if I use that word, that if there is an adverse reported in any of the African countries, the other national regulatory authority can have access to that. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. So here I'm just sharing some of the work that has been done or is being done by the Africa Medical Device Forum, and I have included the website where this information can be done. As I indicated, it's posted in the AUDA-NEPAD website. That's where we can find if people are looking for information for the Africa Medical Device. So if you press the blue link on top towards your left, you'll be able to go there. A lot of work has been done by the Africa Medical Device Forum. There are guidelines that are published, and then there were trained and workshops were held regarding the implementation of the website, of the guidelines, where the industry also had an opportunity to attend, as well as the various national regulatory authority being supported by AUDA-NEPAD jointly together with the WHO when the dissemination of this guideline were put in place. And based on that, some of the countries have started using this, adopting or adapting the guidelines as part of their daily operations in their national regulatory authority. Next slide, please. Sorry. So as I indicated, the effort that has been done is capacitating national regulatory authority, sharing Agnes earlier spoke about the regulatory framework that has been updated, and that model will really assist and training has been done and communication actually has been shared with various national regulatory authority in Africa regarding the new updated model, and that will assist in capacitating, especially upcoming, as indicated, various national regulatory authority are at different levels. So the updated model will assist most countries to start putting regulations in place, which will go back to the mandate of most regulatory authorities to make sure that the products that are in their respective national regulatory authority are safe, of quality, and they are performing as intended. So that has been done, as I indicated in the earlier slide. The AMDF has published guidelines, if you check the website, which will be are used by various national regulatory authority. And I'm looking at harmonization. Earlier, our colleague from MIDRF spoke about the use of the table of content for product registration. So that will be, most of NRAs will adopt that, and that's what will be promoted under the band of the AMDF, so that a similar technical dossier or table of content is used for registration of medical product and IVDs. And, using various, if you're looking at increasing of awareness on the use of guidelines or the way to find information regarding the medical device regulations, as I indicated, AMDF has done a lot of training or even awareness workshop, including the support of AWOD and NIPAD, as well as the WHO, in making people aware of the documents that are there and that are available. So I have spoken about, doing quality audits as well as the PMS data sharing and working again in collaboration with the various stakeholders. Our colleague earlier spoke about the NRA being affiliate, and those are the things that will be promoted within the ambit of AMDF. It's a new thing that is quite interesting, because being in the same area, having the same understanding on, for example, definition will help us to forge forward as various national regulatory authority. And I further spoke about partnership. We have started, various national regulatory authority have started doing a partnership with various stakeholders that are supporting, the ensuring that there are regulations for medical device and IVD in various countries to ensure that the product that lands in the country are safe and quality and for intended use or effective. So I just gave an example of what we are doing now together with the MDRC, is to assist and promote reliance work, to promote good regulatory practice, to promote harmonization and also standardization, so that we are all in the same page. Next slide, please. So as I'm saying, I'm indicating as one of the strategic objective of the AMDF is to encourage innovation and local production. We collaborate with relevant partners, in being government institution, in being research institution, to promote their requirement as, we communicate with them, collaborate with other stakeholders to speak about the requirements to the various, for example, manufacturers and researchers, for argument's sake. We've spoken about the site audit, and that's one of the areas that AMDF will be focusing in this coming year. Furthermore, other working together with the various partners, will be looking at the centers of excellence, further networking, as well as being more visible. We're being visible, but be more visible, more engagement with various stakeholders with the support from various partners. Technical expert training is one of the topics that is coming up, which is very important. and as well as looking at accreditation of laboratories, looking at twinning practices amongst various national regulatory authority, to mention a few. Next slide, please, Stephen. Yeah, so that will be all. And if you're looking at the convergence, our intention is to build bridges, not walls, so that the collaboration, the stakeholder management I've spoken about, it's a continuous thing. It's not the end to me. Thank you very much, Stephen. And thanks, colleagues, for listening. Those are the 9 South African languages to say thank you. So I hope it's also helpful.
Really, thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you for the double, triple effort to do that with the situation on your voice. I think this is kind of like something common happening these days. So really, thank you very much for the extra effort on this. So, I mean, I don't see any questions coming right now at the Q&A. We are definitely very enthusiastic about the AMDF initiative, and I think that every single effort that all the relevant stakeholders are undergoing as to advance regulatory convergence and implementation of reliance mechanisms as to expedite the availability of medical devices, medical technology to the patients, not only in the region, but globally, and also to support the proper utilization or the best possible way to use the available resources at the national regulatory authorities. I think, I mean, you know, we are all in favor for that, and we are really committed to continue to help and support all these efforts and continue to work hand in hand for that to happen. And I think that the session today is really a wonderful example of how everybody is really committed to advance the agenda in regards of regulatory convergence, and in regards of making a much more effective use of all the available resources. So with this, really, thank you very much. Congratulations for the effort of the AMDF, for your specific efforts and work at SAHPRA. And with this, I would really only like to invite you, if you would like to share like a final closing comment, as unfortunately, Pauline could not stay here for the closing, but probably as you as a vice chair of AMDF just can share a quick comment to close the session today. Thank you very much for all the attendees that stayed like half hour longer than we initially programmed. So thank you very much, and Dimekatso.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Sandra. And thanks to the colleagues, our experts from various areas, you know, from standardization to the MIDRF, and, you know, speaking WHO, speaking to the good regulatory practice. We really appreciate this, because this assists us in promoting the work of the AMDF and supporting us, as well as also assisting us to identify our stakeholders that we need to engage with as AMDF, as well as supporting other national regulatory authority with information on where to go. So, you know, this is a very good platform for networking. And we also appreciate our colleagues also from various angles, industry, research, government entities who have stayed and listened to, you know, the presentation. It does work. And I think we'll appreciate further communication regarding the workshop that will assist us to continuously improve, and as well as, you know, any other topics that is of interest to the industry, and align and be able to come back and communicate that, so we are all aligned and, you know, we are in the same page. Thank you very much. Thanks, Sandra.
So thank you very much. And I don't know if I could use a little bit more of your time. We just got a couple of questions from the audience. So Dimekatso, if it is okay with you, I'll just phrase it and see if we can manage. Otherwise, we will capture those via email. So the first question is, with EU Commission's proposal on MDR-IVDR extension, the biggest question mark for non-EU markets that rely on EU or CE marking are whether health authorities will accept the extended CE certificates that are expired, and if the certificate is not reissued by NB, i.e., if there's no solid document showing the extension, how would the AMDF assist with this harmonization?
Yeah, I think the colleagues are fully aware that the EU has published currently a draft document regarding the extension for the IVDR and MDR. So as the regulator from SAPRA perspective, or also from the AMDF, we will support the way forward because one, as I indicated, one of the mandate of the National Regulatory Authority is access. So once that draft has been finalized by the EU, we also have to consider the risk of access of the product into our various market, and also from AMDF perspective, support our various NRAs into taking a position, because in, for example, in other countries, if there's not CE mark, they will not allow it into the country. So based on the finalization of the draft extension from our colleagues from Europe, that will assist us in making a decision. But at the moment, it's still draft. So we'll have to await the transitional document that needs to be finalized by our colleagues from Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dimakatso. So with this, we're reaching the end of the event today. In the chat box, you will find the link where all the recordings, both in English, Portuguese, and French, and the slide decks are going to be uploaded. May you go and get into further detail as required. A few minutes ago, I also included my email address. May you have an opportunity to forward any question that might have not been responded today, or that would be like a follow-up to what we have learned today, so we can keep in touch. So thank you very much. We are very enthusiastic of all the things that are happening and the ones that are yet to come. So thank you very much, and look forward to see you in a few weeks' time.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.